Chapter 19 of Wonderful London, Its Lights and Shadows of Humour and Sadness. Author unknown. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Yearsley. The Last Man in Town. There is something peculiarly unpleasant in being the last at anything. The last to enter a public conveyance. The last to arrive at a house where dinner has been kept waiting for you. The last to get into a crowded church, the last in the pit of a theatre, the last in a competitive examination, the last to pay rent, the last on the score at billiards, the last when the last train is full. I have been all these, and am like to be them all again, but I know a deeper shade of misery still. It is to be the last man in town. Now, understand me, I do not mean this to be taken literally, for reasons that are sufficiently obvious, but I mean to say that, with reference to my own particular set, and to that large circle of acquaintance in which I am wont to walk, I am speaking no more or less than truth. One by one, the men whom I count my companions have disappeared, and have gone to disport themselves on the moors and streams of England, or to form members of the great army of Britons which annually invades the continent. In companies ranging from 2 to 14, the married among my acquaintance have fled from the metropolis. If foolish enough to seek them at their usual dwelling, I learn them gone and far from home. I rap at some well-known door, and wait 5 minutes for admission. At the end of that time I am made wiser by the information that the family are at Scarborough, but that Master B. who, being about to return to Dr. Birch's care, is necessarily absent from his mamma, is at home if I will please to walk in. I do not please to see Master B. nor to walk in. I turn again into the hot street and try my fortune elsewhere, but with no greater satisfaction. I enter the liberty of the Temple and find it in possession of painters and men who delight in whitewash. I dodge under one of their ladders and escape into the next court, where I flush a listless porter or a policeman whose ennui is so deep that he is not to be roused by that which many times has moved me to intemperate wrath, namely the passing attention of the little boys to the great knocker on the side gate. Doubtfully I ascend the staircase of a Templar friend, and arrive at the top of his 3 flights of stairs, only to find a sported oak and no one within it. A piece of paper fastened to the door with a broken pen informs the reader that a clerk attends daily for a couple of hours, and that parcels are to be left at the porter's lodge. I have no desire to see N.'s clerk, nor have I any parcels to leave at the lodge. The notice has no further interest for me than that it furnishes unmistakable evidence of the absence of my friend. At the Cock, where I am wont to dine on the smallest possible steak for the largest possible price, and where until lately the renowned plump waiter was to be seen in his suit of well-worn black, there is a howling desolation. I could dine at 4 tables all at once. The man who squeezes his voice into the order tube at the Cheshire Cheese is sadly out of practice. There is a melancholy about these places which is positively sickening. The pint of bitter with which I wash down my steak is no longer grateful, and the steak itself gives me indigestion. Dick's and the Rainbow are no longer pleasant places to me. They are the resort of casual visitors, whose faces I know not. I return to the Temple, and ascend to my own 3rd pair in Court. Here too is small comfort. As I come in, I find my laundress busied with the mysteries in which she engages twice a day. I know by sure signs that she considers my presence an intrusion. I know too that she deems her full pay which she draws by virtue of my being here, a poor compensation for the loss of confab she suffers in the parliament of her peers, plus the want of that precious right to examine all my belongings, which she enjoys only in part, so long as I remain. I come in and sit down to a cup of coffee and a pipe, by myself. I prolong the time usually spent over the latest news in the Startler, and conclude, as I read the comments in its leaders, that the writer of them is, as I am, a last man. I finish my pipe, and make an appearance of settling to work. The well-known volumes are beside me, and on the table are the many sheets of paper containing the embryo of that great work on the scintilla juris in contingent remainders, with which I purpose to astonish the profession. For once the magic of the work is vain. I have no pleasure in it. Charm scintilla never so wisely. The ears of my ambition and my zeal are alike shut fast. It is clear there will be no addition made to that immortal work tonight. I have arrived at that point in my treatise where it behoves me to consider the subtle question as to the whereabouts of Scintilla under certain circumstances, to decide whether she is to be found in nubibus, in mare, or in gremio legis. Of course, I have my own opinion about it, but being desirous today of informing myself more precisely as to the opinions of other sagas on the subject, I ascended the steps of the library of our society for this purpose. I was stopped by a closed gate bearing an inscription to the effect that the place would be reopened in October. Whether it was discussed at this rebuff, or whether my indisposition to apply myself welled from deeper springs, I know not, but this is certain, that tonight I turned my thoughts to other things, and took to conjecturing what my absent friends had been doing this day. I pictured in my mind the lissom Jones in Switzerland, covered with glory and perspiration, having just achieved the hitherto unaccomplished feat of getting to the top of some long-named horn. No feeling of envy arose in my mind as I thought of the dangers he had passed. No desire did I feel to emulate his noble act, or to share in his glory. An ardent lover of nature, I am content to look on her from, quote, the valleys low, where the mild whispers use of shades, and wanton winds, and gushing brooks, unquote. And my highest ambition has been satisfied by an ascent of 4,000 feet. I have admired in their grandeur the giants of the Alps, and have felt them to be wonderful, but if I am put to show my love for mountains by walking up them, then I say, and I say it unblushingly, that Primrose Hill is dearer to me than all the mountains of Jura. I passed on in thought to where E. H. tired of waiting for my promised company, has gone forth on his trip in North Devon. I saw him at Barnstaple. I saw him at Bideford, crossing the many-spanned bridge which Torridge suffers to curb her. In the spirit, I was with him as he stood at Buck's Mill, and looked from the cliffs over Mort Bay and Clovelly, and gave my earnest vote in favour of his proposal, at any cost, to get over to Lundy. We walked together through Clovelly Court, and down the stair-shaped street to the little pierhead, where we took the boat of the Happy Return, and went for a bathe. We dined at the odd inn, which we entered from the roof, and walked on in the cool of the evening to pleasant Hartland Quay. We went over the Abbey Church, and through Sir George Stucley's Park, and then by the cliff road to Marsland and the church of St. Maur-Wenner. At length we found ourselves on the thundering shore of Bude, looking where the Ben Coolan was so frightfully wrecked one autumn, and were debating whether to go on to Tintagel Head and see King Arthur's castle, when I was awakened to the fact that I was not at Bude Haven, where I would be, but at Court, London, by a vigorous knocking at the door of my room. I go out and find the postman clamorous for twopence, the amount of postage due on a letter addressed to a friend of mine, who, having my consent to his name being painted on my door, is good enough to allow me to pay all charges on his numerous letters and parcels. I take up my hat and walk out. There is no opera. There are few theatres open. I go along the motley Strand, and far from experiencing the inclination which Charles Lamb tells us he felt to weep for sympathy at the sight of so much life, I am in a mood to feel the full force of the aphorism that a great crowd is a great solitude. People whom I know not, nor wish to know, pass by me, and there is no tie between us save the common one of humanity. They do not even evince the interest in me which it seems the laundresses have. These have long since reckoned me up and made wonderfully shrewd guesses at the cause of my detention. The other day I passed a knot of them in Brick Court, and heard, as I believe, reference made to myself in the speech of one, who, for that very reason, I would rather live unattended than engage as my servant, though it is more than probable I was not the subject of her talk. "He can't, he ain't got the money." This has rankled in my mind, and, like Juno, I hide the wound deep in my breast, against the day of my spite. Depressed by the absence of friends, depressed by scintilla juris, depressed by the general depression of the few people I meet, and depressed by other matters of which it were long to write, I return to my chamber, and determine to embody my thoughts in a letter to some friend. I bethink me, to whom shall I write? What will W., who is shooting partridges by the covey at Bury, care about a letter from me? What is it to the acrobatic Jones at Lucerne that I feel lonesome tonight? How will jolly D., with his equally jolly wife, resting at Broadstairs after an 8 months' innings in the Reporters' Gallery and the Courts of Law, marvel what possessed my brain this Saturday night, if I venture to lay my complaints before him at his next breakfast time? He of the West Country will vote me a bore if I plague him with my fancies, and my lady friends will probably fail to understand why, if I find town so lonesome, I do not quit it as they do. Thus I find small encouragement in the way of letter writing, yet my thoughts are such that I deem it better to relate them to a statue or picture than to suffer them to pass in smother. The bust of the man whose wisdom suggested the last sentence is gazing at me as I write, but looks so unsympathetic, so profoundly indifferent, that I hesitate before speaking to it of these things. And therefore it is that I sit down at this advanced hour of the day, partly to relieve my mind of a burden which is halved by the mere act of writing about it, and partly that I may remind the holiday-making public of how hard and unpleasant a thing it is to be a last man in town. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of Wonderful London, Its Lights and Shadows of Humour and Sadness. Author unknown. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Yearsley. Picturesque London. From Highgate Archway on Christmas Day. To the artists of the Christmas magazines and papers, greeting. Be good enough, gentlemen, to accept my scorn. Be good enough to understand that I denounce you as the Perkin Warbecks, the Lambert Simnels, the Cock Lane Ghosts, and Johanna Southcotes of art. You are impostors, gentlemen, not in your work, no, I know that well enough. Never did more cunning pencils work away on boxwood blocks. Never did more poetical minds blend with more expert fingers. But all this increases your shame, gentlemen. You draw so admirably that we give in to your imposition, and suffer ourselves to be led captive by it. About Christmas, for instance, why do you still portray that genial, ruddy, ice-bound, holly-crowned giant? Why do you still fill our periodicals with pictures of snow-covered landscapes, snow-clad churches, ice-bound lakes, golf parties, sleighing parties, frozen-out, distressed damsels dying on snow-covered doorsteps, robins picking very black crumbs off very white lawns, carol-singing villagers blowing their nails and beating their breasts for the superinducement of caloric? How long is it since you saw any of these sights at Christmas time? How long ago is it since you saw snow at all? Or since there was any good skating in London? I remember frosty winters when I was a boy, and I mind me of a certain time when London was snowed up, when all the cabs that were out had 2 horses, and the omnibuses did not run, and there was a strange silence in all the streets, as in a city of the dead. Sometimes when I talk to people about things being different from what they were some years ago, I am told, the change is in you. You feel differently about such matters. You're getting on, you know. And then I'm impressed with the information that time flies, and that we are, none of us, younger, and that each year makes a difference, and various other novel and interesting remarks of the same nature. But humbly subscribing to all this, I still maintain that the present style of representing Christmas is a mockery, a delusion, and a snare, and calculated to bring us into contempt in the eyes of our children, who will regard us as a set of mummers playing at an exploded rite, and will feel for us the same sort of pity that we feel for dear old George Cruikshank, when we see him leaving his own quips and drolleries, in which he has never been excelled, to attempt the portrayal of a modern swell, in the high-collared, long-tailed coat, ribbed silk stockings and pumps of 30 years ago. When I rose this Christmas morning, I saw no vestige of ice or snow. The grass was brilliantly green, the buds were shooting on many shrubs, the air was balmy, and the entire aspect of nature was April-like and genial. The conventionalities were in full play. Yes, I will allow that people wished each other a Merry Christmas. The gardener, as he touched his hat, told me he had sent in a good store of Christmas logs for firing, and there was the usual excitement among the young folk as to pudding and mincemeat. We found the church, duly decorated with holly and laurel, bits of yew uncomfortably mingling with the other evergreens, and reminding one of Mr. Tennyson's tree, which, quote, graspest at the stones that name the underlying dead, thy fibres net to dreamless head, thy roots are wrapped around the bones, end quote, and the sockets of the parson's candlesticks flaring with curling green. Regular Christmas sermon from the parson, an old one, I think, as I detect in it very frosty bits about hardened glebe and ice-bound rill, and general recollection of the illustrated journals, not at all appropriate to the existing temperature. Pew opener conventional too, with a Christmas shiver and a Christmas cough before the receipt of the annual gratuity, and the Christmas grin, and wishes of a many, many happy years after the pocketing thereof. We give up conventionality when we get outside the porch and walk slowly home, and after lunch we throw open the French windows of the dining room and bask in the genial sun which pours in through them. Far away, over the hushed fields and across the bar made by the quiet little railway line, lie the outposts of the sleeping giant London, a long line of terrace, very seasidey in its aspect, tall and gaunt and stucco-y, very suggestive of lodgings at from 2 to 4 guineas a week, according to the floor, and obviously looking on to the parade where the old gentlemen walk up and down and cough, and the young people flirt and smoke in front. No London for us, though, today. The dog-cart is at the door, but Brown George's head shall not be turned towards the streets. Further afield, Brown George? And, responsive to my touch on the reins, the brave horse starts off down the lane, and striking through the heart of the groves of the Evangelist, turns into the broad road, skirting the Regent's Park. The people, what the noble Tory writers querulously call the plebs, are out here in force, lolling, idling, romping, as though it were full summer. Fashion doesn't seem to alter much in the mechanic's Sunday dress. So long as I can recollect, it has been long-tailed coat, black satin waistcoat, black trousers very crumply at the knees, and hard, shiny black hat. So it is now, exact in every particular. Why do men don this frightful garb? Is it with the notion that their appearance then approximates to that of a gentleman? Because they are utterly wrong. Is it that they think the costume pretty? Because they are frightfully mistaken. Why do men want to be mistaken for what they are not? I know that if anyone were to say to me, "Eusebius, my boy, I'll make you up to look like a marquis, an earl, a baronet, or a Lombard Street banker," I should decline the honour. And why on earth does Chips the carpenter, an honest man and a very good-looking one in his working clothes, try to disguise himself in an utterly unmistakable, hideous sham? The sward is dotted with red and blue children, appallingly bright, and the seats are sprinkled with the military, now squat and sheepish, now tall, whiskered and impassioned, and with young persons in service, who are supposed to be at church, and whose conversation seems to be limited to the repetition of the sentence, "Get along with ya!" Vagrant boys, too, we see about, of course, fiends who mock at us as we pass, and who yell after us, "3 gents out for a herring," as Brown George turns through Gloucester Gate and enters Camden Town. Do you know Camden Town? A sweet spot, the home, par excellence, of the commercial clerk of from 30 shillings a week to 250 a year. An estimable, responsible, hard-working man. I have a word or two, not about him, but about the houses. Houses all built to meet the requirements of the clerkly world. They even look as if they had been manufactured of dingy blotting paper, and are so fragile that they could be taken out with an eraser. Thoroughly respectable, though. None of your low lodgings, or anything of that sort. House, nice parlour, wire blind in a window, very shiny, sticky, gummy furniture. Chairs with American cloth seats, which stick to your trousers. Vase with everlasting flowers and 2 china dogs on mantelpiece. Very bad, cheap print of 3 chorister boys. Oh, the difference between the sweet youths and the real dirty-nosed choir boy of a country church. On the wall. Little mat by the door. Nice drawing room, all in white maple wood and cane bottoms, with white muslin curtains and a crumb cloth over the carpet. Quite warm and comfortable. A black beetly kitchen, where Maria Jane cooks everything with coal garnish and soot sauce, and bedrooms which are well described as airy. I vow that I hate Camden, and regard him with loathing. All his terraces, Bayham and Jeffrey and Brecknock, his road and his villas, his square, which is horribly pretentious and uncomfortable. He looks so horribly prim and pharisaical. He looks so unlike real hospitality, so unlike oysters for supper, or a cigar and a glass of grog. He looks so like a plate of mixed biscuits and a glass of sherry at 27 shillings the dozen. So like 2 formal little dinners in the year when Jones the greengrocer empties the oyster sauce down your neck, and a mild evening party with very weak negus. No flirting, and the drawing-room door under the hostess's bed. I often wonder how jolly Charles Dibdin, the songwriter, who is buried in the graveyard here, can rest in such precincts, and wonder that he does not start up and scare the respectable humbugs living round him with a yo-ho chorus. Nor do I care much for Kentish now, though I mind me of the time when he was very dear to me. Then Consule Manlio, he was inhabited by one whom Mr. Swiveller would indeed have described a jolly old grandfather, the kindest-hearted, most generous, most boy-spoiling of veterans. Ah, the half-crowns from his fob, the whiffs at his pipe, the half-holidays begged by him from school, the wine-glasses of toddy subtracted from his own potential jorum, the gardening done under his directions, the gun-lock oiling and fishing tackle assortment which alone were hours of rapture. I can see his face at this instant as I look up from my paper, when, as a boy of 12, I had been expressing an admiration for gin punch, and a maiden aunt of the other branch of the family asked, in virtuous indignation, "Where did you ever taste such a low beverage, sir?" I can see the old gentleman's twinkling eye, and his forefinger laid suggestively on his lip. Low beverage, indeed. When I remember what it was, I wish I had a glass of it, and the stomach to bear it unharmed, at this present writing. But the old gentleman is long since departed, and Kentish Town has quite changed from what it was in his day. Then it was a pretty little village, with trees here and there before its ale-houses, with red-faced old country houses standing in their gardens. A little colony to which, when cabs penetrated, the horse was put up, and the cabman sat in his shirt-sleeves on the bench before the tavern door, smoking his pipe, and wondering at the rural quiet around him. Now a big church stands on the spot where stood the squat brick chapel, which sufficed for the old urbans of Kentish. Scores and scores of Cockney villas have been scattered pell-mell over the pleasant old fields. Gin palaces and pawnbrokers' shops have crowded the precincts, and a Holborn publican here built a retreat, i.e. a tea-garden tavern, for sing-song, dancing and fireworks, which, however, I am delighted to say, the magistrates refused to license. And now, at the foot of Highgate Hill, we leave Brown George to the groom, and then, quitting my companions for a time, I go on a little pilgrimage, undertaken by me half a dozen times a year, and always on Christmas Day, to the city of the dead, the cemetery. It is well for us, brother, thus occasionally to visit the spots where the lost loved ones are laid. It is the one break in our commerce with the world, the one oasis of real feeling in the great desert of life. Hither one invariably comes alone. Here one puts off the close-fitting mask which we wear under every other circumstance, and here we commune silently with the dead, to whom only a fleeting thought is spared in the busy worldly round. Ah, dear one, lying low, though the eyelid is no longer moist, and though the lips can mention thy name now without quivering, thou art not forgotten. But few of the promises of amendment made in the first great grief at the loss of thee have been kept. Bit by bit the good resolutions have been abandoned, and yet, on these Christmas days especially, has memory peculiar powers of revocation, and the dead live again in recollection more vividly than at other seasons. I see that the cemetery has had many visitants today. Many of the tombs bear immortelles, or branches of evergreen, or little bouquets of flowers, and on one, the gravestone of a child, I see a very beautiful little holly cross. There are fewer gapers than usual. Most of those persons I meet are either dressed in mourning or have an earnest, decent expression, showing that their visit there was not without an object. How I hate your cemetery visitors on a Sunday afternoon, your gaping, lolling, mooning boys and girls, your drivelling, open-mouthed, middle-aged drearies who just walk up to the cemetery afore tea, and who may be heard bawling to each other, "Look here, Jemima, here's a beautiful one," or "Ain't this a ugly tomb, Jane?" and who are always mysteriously inquisitive about the catacombs. Very lovely the cemetery looks as I leave it, with its thousands of gravestones, like a flock of sheep on the side of the green hill. leave it with the strange thought that one day I shall visit it to leave it no more. My companions await me at the far gate, and together we trudge through Highgate, a dull, dreary little hamlet, too big for a village, too small for a town, a place which the march of intellect has left behind, and which has not strength of mind enough to take up the running. Grass grows between the paving flags, and commerce is at a standstill. There is a sufficiency of taverns, but they are small, and of the beer-house order, and, like all other houses, are now tightly closed. I, who have known Highgate any time this quarter of a century, having been birched and bred there, do not see any difference in the place, which appeared to me to be in its normal state of solemn stupidity. But my companions are highly disgusted with Highgate, and want to know if there's nothing to do or nothing to see. Do? Well, they can be sworn on the horns if they like. All the rubbish about not drinking small beer when you can get strong, or not kissing the maid when you can get the mistress. Always unless you like the small beer and the maid best. But that would involve standing unlimited beer to numerous pot-wallopers, and would be a dull proceeding after all. See? Well, I don't know. Yes, by Jove, the archway! Up this lane to the left, past these half-buried houses, standing in their trim gardens, shaded by big trees, and looking almost ancestral, though doubtless let on a term of 7, 14, and so on, to London tradespeople. And now we are at the archway itself. A big stone viaduct with broad balustrades and coping stones, stretching across the Great North Road. Looking north, we see the broad white turnpike road stretching away towards Barnet and St Albans, a road traversed 40 years ago by upwards of 80 four-horse coaches, coaches which employed ostlers and stablemen and helpers, which set down thirsty and hungry travellers at hundreds of wayside inns between London and York, and which have long since been broken up in coachmakers' yards, and had their wheels rent from their bodies and patched onto other vehicles, while the bodies have formed hiding places for the village children, and have had imaginary horses attached to them by the cocks of many village schools. Aye, the glory of the North Road is gone forever. Droves of parched cattle and smoking sheep, a few carriers' wagons, and the lumbering carts of the brickfield bordering the road are all that it sees now, save when some of the stock-broking gents and mincing lane princes, resident at Muswell Hill, come dashing down it in their dog-carts and mail phaetons as a near cut to town. Now turn we the other way, and look at the dim, great, giant London sleeping in the distance. Now, close below us lies Holloway, with Dick Whittington's stone where the runaway prentice heard the bells which bade him turn again and become Lord Mayor of London. Further on, Islington, now become a part of London, but in Cowley's time a little village, as Abraham C. viciously remarks of the metropolis. Quote, "Let but the wicked men from out thee go, and all the fools that crowd thee so, even thou, who dost thy millions boast, a village less than Islington will grow, a solitude almost." End quote. There is the outline of the model prison, and the hundreds of thousands of middle-class homes, from the chimneys of which the Christmas essence is pouring, and the walls of which will for hours echo with Christmas love and merriment. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Wonderful London, Its Lights and Shadows of Humour and Sadness. Author unknown. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Yearsley. Sketches from an office window. Piccadilly Circus. Day after day we look down from our windows on some shifting aspect of the diorama of London life. Assuredly, from our post of vantage, we are able to discover that Piccadilly Circus is one of the main arteries of that life. Our office intersects the mighty thoroughfares of Regent Street and Piccadilly. If a meditative philosopher were to take his stand beneath the lamp-post of the circus for 24 hours, and there have been meditative philosophers who have been very fond of doing that sort of thing, he would see enough of life and incident to occupy him fully, especially if he should be of the sect of the laughers or weepers. A man, however, would hardly linger the whole of a day at the Piccadilly Circus, however intrinsically important the situation may be, unless he wished to establish a reputation with the police as a harmless lunatic. But when we are in a meditative vein, we have only to go to the office window, and by taking the 24 hours in detail, doing a bit now and a bit at another time, we achieve the day and the night. It is a case of the suave mare magno. Amid the unrest and tumult, we are safe within our sanctum, and the heaving sea of life may be carefully noted, and is most worthy of accurate observation. We have breakfasted, and are down, for once, with the porter, at our office at 9, punctual as the sun or the Horse Guard's clock. How clear and clean does the long line of Piccadilly appear, stretching onwards towards palaced terraces and the waving foliage of the parks. It is not often that a London street is clear and clean. Even at 9 its aspect is sullied over, but 2 or 3 hours earlier, before the shutters of a single shop are unclosed, before any but the earliest labourers and artisans are wending their way to their places of business, the street is flooded with the glorious primal sunshine, and quite a soft country air is blowing up through the defile of houses. As we begin our work, we murmur, "What a glorious day!" and amid proofs and letters, we have rebellious fancies how much jollier it would be at Cowes or the heights of Richmond Park. Then we arise meditatively and look out of window. There is no need to go to the Isle of Wight or to Richmond for novelty and interest. It is here, ready made to hand, here in Piccadilly Circus, if we can only spot it. Not so very much of it, is our second thought. Here are the omnibuses, steadily setting in eastwards with their freight of city men, and here are the casual passengers hurrying along. Not much novelty here, you say? I defy you to get romance out of a city bus. I am not so sure. Little Jones, our rising artist, fell in love with and married his wife on an acquaintance, much of which was carried on in the interior of an omnibus. I grant you, however, that this was not at 9 o'clock, but at noon, when the omnibuses will be as full of ladies as they are now with the men. Still, there is something interesting even in these cartloads of the unworthy sex. From what snug suburban homes they come up. Look at the buttonhole rose, which relieves the white waistcoat so gaily. These are the men who have got their gardens and cottages not far from the silvery Thames and its wooded banks. Nice women brushed their hats for them this morning, and waved their hands and blew or gave soft kisses. You must not smile at this reminiscence of domesticity. What is all the hard work of practical life but the mere apparatus of that little home? Business is only a cumbrous machinery set in motion by the hidden spring of love. Many of those fellows will be working like horses all day, simply that they may wear white waistcoats and have roses in their buttonholes, and some little woman to watch them through the gate of the suburban villa as they proceed to mount the bus for the city. And as for the pedestrians, I think I may venture on one simple classification, which is that when most of the young men are going eastwards, probably a majority of the young girls are going westwards. They must be at their shops by 9 o'clock. There are, of course, all sorts and sizes of them, but no class is so common as those of elastic step and cheerful face and graceful manner. And why should not such be the case? They are filling up their own little niches in the world competently and well, honestly earning a slender livelihood and a trifle over for natural luxury in the way of dress and bonnets, and enjoying the real happiness of a harmonious and well-occupied life. If you only knew their individual histories, you would see that nearly all of them have their part in the home history. The parent, loving and anxious, the brother or sister or friend with whom they correspond, their own petted books and photographs, the clergyman or kind lady who tries to be friendly with them and help them on. I do not know how it may be in France, but the little English milliner is a modest, graceful little girl, as a rule, and shame on the novelist or playwright who represents her as anything else. I hope those great whiskered funny fellows will not peer too closely into the bonnet, albeit the blush is becoming enough, still less that they will say anything rude. They nearly all want to be married, do these little girls, and most of them have their legitimate aspirations gratified some fine day. But many of them have to regret the freedom and independence of their early life. But the day wears on. It is now 11. I am forcibly reminded that we are in the immediate neighbourhood of Leicester Square. It is time for the déjeuner à la fourchette, and the French or the Belgians are about to take the first dinner of their day. The English hotels are rather dull, but the foreign restaurants are now all alive. How our foreign friends, over their black coffee, must wonder at the substantial breakfasts which our city friends can make the first thing in the morning. The circus is a great place for foreigners, where you may observe them helpless among the bewilderment of omnibuses and the impositions of cabmen. Now you may notice one or two knots of sprightly girls, but not so pleasant or healthy looking as the other young people whom we have been talking of. They belong to the ballet of the opera, and are making their way in the direction of Her Majesty's. You will probably see the carriage of the great prima donna herself. Now, all about the circus, as you doubtless know, are the offices belonging to different steamboat companies. It is not difficult to detect a group of a certain kind every now and then, especially in the holiday and tourist season. Your customary traveller takes his berth as coolly as he would call a cab, but every now and then there are different kinds of visitors. People who go into the office to make inquiries and come out of it to make consultations on the pavement. People who have Bradshaw and Murray projecting from their pockets. People who are irresolute and nervous. People who scan the weather and the direction of the wind, who have doleful thoughts about the passage across the channel, or who are entrusting themselves for the first time to the sea, with feelings analogous to those which once actuated Christopher Columbus. Now, just lounge for a minute as those omnibuses rest at their stations at the corner of the circus. This is the great starting place where prudent people may save a penny. It is wonderful how many 100 yards very solvent people will walk in order to catch the omnibus at the corner and save a copper. I can very well understand it in the case of that thin, delicate-looking lady who is doubtless a morning governess, working through her hours of tuition at the rate of a shilling an hour. She will take an omnibus to save time and boot leather, but she will also walk from the Green Park to the circus to save that denarius, which will mount up in time to something which will be considerable to her. As the Atlas omnibus passes, just look at that merry party of children. They are going out for a holiday to the zoological gardens, and are chattering about the monkeys and the elephants. Then that party of ladies are coming from the Clapham regions to pay a visit to St. John's Wood, and so great are these London distances, of which our country cousins will never make themselves fully conscious, that they fully recognise that the call is the real business of a day. It is not to be wondered at that friends and relations who do not live in the same postal district see so little of each other. Then to see as old Pepys would say, the little gamin of newspaper boys dash through the whirl of vehicles to offer those evening papers which are published a little after breakfast time, but which have that humorous title. About noon we can just distinguish the tinkling of the bell of our parish church, St. James's, Piccadilly, giving its little heeded summons for the passers-by to come for matin song. But for most Londoners, laborare est orare must be the ecclesiastical motto. Sometimes the street just beyond our office is gay with festive carriages and white-favoured horses. There is a grand wedding at St. James's, and our parish church, in respect to grand weddings, is almost even now with St. George's, Hanover Square. Now you recognise the men of the clubs in the Pall Mall direction. Lots of them are coming from the region of Jermyn Street, on their way to their bow windows. You may easily guess which of them belong to the Army and Navy, and which to the University clubs, and some very acute people will almost venture to distinguish the Carlton men from the Reform. The man of the Garrick Club forms a genus by himself, and by the knowing ones is easily distinguishable. There are not many lawyers about our circus, except during the session of Parliament, when we see the acute, combative faces which may be afterwards recognised in the committee rooms of the House of Commons. Literary men are much more plentiful. Near our office, in St. James's Square, is the London Library, which literary men know and love so well, with its pleasant rooms and all the good books in all the languages. It is the most natural walk in the world for the present writer to vacate the seat before the office window for the London Library, or to betake himself from that crowd of books to the crowd of faces. In the afternoon we are at our busiest. The shopping in Regent Street is at its height. The carriages roll past from Piccadilly at Pall Mall. Later they set in steadily towards Hyde Park Corner. There are now fewer business people here than in any other part of London. The dandies and the exquisites make their brief appearance. Perhaps the smart young men smile at that studious-looking man with a coat a little threadbare, who is carrying a heavy folio under his arm, which he has just purchased in a neighbouring bookseller's shop, and our neighbourhood is rich in these. He is, nevertheless, one of the most distinguished of our statesmen, and there are many wreathed smiles for him from carriage windows, if he would only condescend to note them. It is quite refreshing to meet with a great man who can afford to dress badly, and dresses badly accordingly. I only wish I was rich enough to wear a shocking bad hat. I remember some years ago happening to walk behind one of our most illustrious judges, as he had been walking up Parliament Street, and was making a cut through the wilderness of lanes on the north of Trafalgar Square. He had a greatcoat on, of the old-fashioned broadcloth and make, and had a roll in his walk certainly the reverse of any elegance of attitude. He was rather elbowed in the crowd, and there was a man distributing printed papers who was very anxious to force one upon him, and perhaps because he was waved away in the most peremptory manner, the fellow was very pertinacious in the attempt. I stopped this troublesome man, and said, "My friend, do you know who that is?" "And who may he be?" was the answer, with an impudent leer. "That is the great judge, Lord Chief blank blank." I have seldom seen a man so taken aback. He gasped for breath, and was evidently under the impression that the great judge would then and there pass on him a sentence of penal servitude, and consign him to some policeman for its execution. This little incident happened about the time that Macaulay had rooms in the adjacent Albany, and he would roll along towards the circus, as the Times said, muttering half aloud the sentences which were one day to astonish and delight the world. Looking westwards towards sunset, we often observe a fine effect of colour in the evening sky, not on the ocean alone, where the sunset at sea has its noble effect as the lordly disk dips suddenly, nor yet on the countryside, where the red light is flashed on tower and tree, but in busy London also, when the smoke is transposed to flame, or the clouds gather into thunderous masses as if to make a pall for a doomed city. At times we obtain pictorial effects which even a Turner might reproduce, and yet be thought exaggerated. I think that many persons on their homeward journey have seen with wonder some such effects as these, as they have passed our office windows, travelling westwards, like the wise men from the east. When the fresh breeze of evening has sprung up, and the lamplighter is doing his rapid errand along the streets, once more we recognise a changed aspect. The young girls are let loose from the shops, and, a little jaded, but still cheerful and pleasant, they have now their dearly earned evening's leisure before them. Men look hungry and are going to dine. Our French friends in particular are in a state of pleasing excitement about Leicester Square. Men who have gazed complacently at the turtle at the restaurant at St. James's Hall are now proceeding thitherward with the intent to convert such turtle into human tissue. The chances are that on an evening there is almost a mob near our office of those who are going to St. James's Hall. There are, of course, different kinds of mob. There is the musical mob, the political mob, and the ecclesiastical mob. Many others there are who wander on with no desire for amusement within walls, blinding light, and a heated atmosphere, but only desire to breathe the fresh air of the parks, the lungs of London, and to wander on beneath the quiet stars, and gain, after the aching day, some sense of tranquillity and peace. Now again there is a steady roll in the season of carriages driving eastwards. They are bearing away cheerful parties to the opera and the theatres. We see some very pretty sights from our office windows. It is almost as good as being in an opera stall with a good lorgnette. The ladies are in full evening costume with light wrappers, cheerful and animated, enjoying the anticipation of their amusement as much as they will enjoy the amusement itself. They are in very pretty costumes, with eyes and hair to match. They pass with tantalizing quickness. We can only get peeps at a kaleidoscope. Then our streets will be quiet for a space, till, in continuous rumble, we hear the sounds of the homeward wheels. Should a smart shower come down, the passengers are soon flying, and we are left solitary. Instead of a shower, it is perhaps a thunderstorm, and the confusion and flight are still more marked. Then it is the time for gentlemen of a scientific turn of mind to take meteorological observations and send their remarks to the Times. Gradually it grows quite late. The last bus eastward has gone, and soon the last bus westward is gone also. Then you may see people of a restless turn of mind promenading the circus, with looks of gloom and discontent. These are the unfortunates who are too late for the last bus. They loiter about in a wavering and despondent manner. Then some of them hail cabs, while the impecunious ones make up their minds and bodies for a heavy homeward trudge. Ah me! Times have indeed changed since we first heard of Piccadilly. Lord Clarendon tells us in his history how, when he was plain Edward Hyde, and not the Chancellor, he and his friends would take horse near Westminster Hall and ride out into the fields adjacent, and how, at that time, there was a pleasant bowling alley in the country district called Piccadilly. The long arms of London are now stretching out far and wide, and the pleasant bowling alleys of the present will be the crowded thoroughfares of the future. How odd were those proclamations which the Stuarts used to issue against the huge overgrown size of London. There was a well-known political rhyme at the commencement of this century. Quote, "What London is to Paddington, such is Pitt to Addington." End quote. The London of today, compared with the London of the Stuarts, is very much what London is to Paddington. There are, however, no Mohawks abroad in the streets, and the tribe that correspond to them have better manners, though they keep later hours. The mention of those late hours brings us very much back to the point of time where we started. We have really been twice round the clock. Westward it is still dark, but eastward, behind the looming dome of St. Paul's, there are streaks of colour which will whiten, deepen, broaden, till there is a great glare, and the awful rose of dawn is once more opened. It is a time of deep slumber, and all that mighty heart is lying still. And yet not all, for even at Piccadilly Circus, as elsewhere, the monotonous calm is broken by hurried footsteps and random voices. Some of the earliest sons of labour are going on to their toil. Some of the strayed revellers from dance or banquet are going to their late couches. The children of night and the children of morning meet. Here is the clear musical whistle, and here the broken glee or snatch from hardly sober lips. Such are the sights which are to be seen from our office windows. There is nothing new under the sun. It is very much the same in our 19th Christian century as when Horace and Juvenal wrote about the Subura at the commencement of our era. Tel est la vie. Quote, so runs the glass of time from hour to hour. End quote. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Wonderful London, Its Lights and Shadows of Humour and Sadness. Author unknown. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Yearsley. Half an hour in a servants' registry office. Having occasion recently to repair, by appointment, to one of those places which have of late become quite institutions in this country, a servants' registry office, I was let in for half an hour's entertainment in what passed within my hearing, though it presented probably but a sample of the daily proceedings in an establishment of the kind. I had come to meet a young person whose services I was anxious to secure, from the strong terms in which she had been recommended to me, but as I was before the time appointed, and she was considerably after, I was placed in the position of an unintentional witness of what transpired in the interval. Let me first of all observe that the office in question was kept by a female, a married woman of well-merited reputation for respectability and judgment, who had now been doing business for years in that line, and, it was said, had made a good thing of it. She had her stated hours of business and did nothing else. Formerly she had kept a shop, a greengrocer's on a small scale, carrying on the two businesses together, but she found that the two lines did not somehow suit one another, that the supplying her customers with apples and cabbages interfered so with her domestic transactions that, favouring no doubt the one that was more lucrative, she disposed of her stock in trade, converted her shop into what she termed her office, with an ante or waiting room, pulled down the old signboard, and replaced it by another which proclaimed to the passing world, in gilt and blue, that the undivided attention of the proprietress was devoted to her registry. She was a person eminently adapted for the calling she had selected. In her dress she was faultlessly neat and simple. Never did you see upon her, at least in business hours, so much as a superfluous bit of ribbon, far less anything approaching the gay or flashy. Her manner, without being dry, was thoroughly businesslike, and the same to all her customers, whether it were peeress or poor curate's wife, whether it were the employer of a dozen servants, or only of one of all work. She preserved consistently the same civil demeanour to everyone, so that all came away with a correspondingly good opinion of Mrs. Primworthy. The young woman whom I expected, not having arrived, Mrs. Primworthy begged that I would take a seat in the anteroom already referred to, which accordingly I did, hoping as I did so that my detention might not be long. This apartment evidently served as Mrs. Primworthy's sitting room when she was not pursuing her professional avocations. There was a convenient window in the dividing wall, through which, when seated, you could take a panoramic view of the so-called office. This intermediate window had been left open, so that not only could I see, if I wished, those in the next room, but I could also hear, in fact, I could not help hearing, their conversation. Having accordingly taken a chair, I readily accepted also the offer of a newspaper, and for a few moments it engaged my attention. But I soon found reading to be impossible, owing to the distractions of the adjacent audience chamber, so I gave up the attempt. My attention was first drawn off on the arrival of a lady in her carriage and pair, who, having alighted, proceeded to relate to Mrs. Primworthy her pitiable case. Her countenance, I fancied, bore a look of harassment, and as I heard her disclose the plight that she was in, I certainly did not wonder that she should evince something like anxiety. "Well, Mrs. Primworthy," she began, "I am in great trouble. My servants are all leaving me, and I cannot imagine the reason why. When I say all, I mean all excepting my cook, who came to me about a fortnight ago. I do hope she will stay, for really she is invaluable, but all the rest have given me notice, and that within a day or two of one another. They seem, without any cause, to have taken a whim into their heads to leave me in less than a month from now. I feel it so. I cannot tell you. When I think of the ingratitude of their behaviour, to say nothing of the perplexity they have placed me in, it almost overcomes me. And then we have visitors coming to stay with us. Oh, Mrs. Primworthy, I am quite bewildered at the prospect." "Well, ma'am, I'm exceedingly sorry to hear it, but you surely don't mean to say that all your servants have given warning?" "Yes, indeed I do. Now, you know our old nurse, who has been with us for years, and who I supposed was so attached to the family that she could not have endured the thought of leaving us. Well, she was the very first positively to give me notice. That I thought bad enough. Then, one by one, the others followed her example. My lady's maid, who suits me to a nicety, and my housemaid, and even that steady young man Jones, whom I was so thankful to you for finding for me. He says he must seek another situation too." "It is certainly very trying, ma'am, isn't it? I wonder whatever can be the cause of it all. Has there been nothing unpleasant with them that you can think of, ma'am? Servants are really getting so high and mighty in their notions now that they'll scarce bear being spoke to." "Oh dear, no. There has been no occasion even for fault-finding lately, and it seems so strange. They all say they are so sorry to go, and speak of the kindness of their master and mistress, yet they cannot think of staying. I have questioned them and entreated them to tell me what is the matter, but the only answer I can get is, things is not as they used to be. But I am not aware of any change. We treat them exactly the same as we always have, and they have no complaints to make. I have only one comfort amidst it all, and that is my new cook, who is the best I think I have ever had. Says she is quite comfortable, and has expressed no wish to leave me. She tells me also she has known of servants elsewhere being seized with a similar freak, and all giving notice together. I think she said in one of the places where she was before, they all did so one morning. But it is fortunate she is not going too, is it not, Mrs. Primworthy?" But Mrs. Primworthy, I noticed, made no answer to this remark, and a peculiar look she put on made me fancy some suspicion had occurred to her. "Do you know, ma'am," she replied, "I should much like to talk a bit to your footman, Jones. He knows me well, and I will reason with him, and tell him what I think of his conduct. It can do no harm, ma'am." "Oh, you are quite at liberty to do so, but I am sure it will be no sort of use. Foolish fellow, he's quite resolved to be gone, as much as any of them. You may try what you can do. Here, Jones, said the lady, stooping forward to beckon the man in. Excuse me, ma'am, interposed Mrs. Primworthy. I must ask you to be so kind as to step into the next room, as I think you won't like speaking out before you. So, if you don't mind, ma'am, just taking a seat in here. Opening the door of the room I was in, Mrs. Primworthy did not finish her sentence, but showed the lady in, and closing the door again, summoned Jones into her presence. I own I felt by no means comfortable on being discovered in my retreat, especially when its facilities for overhearing became apparent. The lady evinced a little surprise at seeing me, and perhaps felt something more, but we both remained seated, still and silent, listening to the conversation between the footman and the registress. And now we had an opportunity of admiring the shrewd tact of Mrs. Primworthy. Instead of opening a direct fire upon the man with the straightforward inquiry why it was he had given notice, she adopted the masterly flank movement of expressing a deep interest in the cook who had lately left the place, and after enumerating her various excellencies, all of which Jones endorsed to the full, she observed, "Yes, indeed, she was what we may call a good servant, and no mistake. And what's more, she was a comfortable sort of a person to live with, and I'm quite certain, Jones, if she'd have remained, you never would have wanted to leave, the same as you are." "No, ma'am, nor none of us wouldn't, and so that's the truth," admitted Jones, falling at once into the trap. "It makes such a deal of difference, doesn't it, Jones, when a cook makes things agreeable in the kitchen? I knew it was so. Servants as has a kind master and mistress don't all give warning that way, without there being a cause for it. That they don't, mum, and according to my notions, servants did ought to be all of a equality like, and not one set over the rest of them. It makes a place beyond all bearing, that it do." I stole a glance across at the lady, and it was really painful to witness the evident discomfort which this observation of the footman occasioned her. She started as if to rise from her chair and stop further discussion, but on Mrs. Primworthy resuming, she sat still. "And then, Jones," added Mrs. Primworthy, "I've always found when a cook do treat her fellow servants bad, it's a thing she can't be cured of, so it isn't any use arguing with her on it." "That's just where it is, mum, and as I says, 'tain't no good any on us a-trying to remain. Her temper be so bad, and she be that there violent, as no one can't bide in sight of her. I'm sure I've always a-wished to live peaceable like with everyone, but that there woman she won't leave none on us alone. 'Tis her nature, I expects, and so sometimes she'll be abusing one, sometimes t'other, and sometimes abusing us all round. Such a time as I've had these here last 10 days. I'd sooner list for a soldier. I'd sooner—" Here Mrs. Primworthy interrupted him. "Your mistress is sadly put about, Jones. Don't you think you could manage to stay on till she was suited, and you might have more time, perhaps, to look out for a good place?" "No, mum, I'm very sorry for missus, but I couldn't stay. I believe as it would be the death of me. I was going to say as I'd sooner break stones from morning to night and get my victuals where I could, than I'd bide in a place where that there woman was. If we was a lot of dogs, she couldn't treat us no worse nor she do. 'Tain't me only either. Everyone as comes to the kitchen catches it from her, just the same. If it's the baker or the grocer's man, she do fly at 'em as if she was a tiger, axing 'em what brings 'em there and such like, till someone of 'em declares as they won't come no more. 'Twas only last night as the butcher's boy said someone else might come for orders, 'cause he shouldn't come again. Never did see such a woman in all my life. She must be abusing or a-scolding summat. Why, one day, if she didn't take and beat the poor cat with the basting spoon, 'cause she happened to come nigh the hastener when she was a-roasting, till the poor animal went limping off under the dresser." The amazement and consternation of the lady, which had been fast fomenting, here reached a climax and completely got the better of her. Unable to sit quiet any longer, she quickly rose from her chair and, presenting herself again in the office, put an end to the discussion. The appearance of his mistress Jones took as a signal for him to withdraw, whereupon the lady recommenced. Well, Mrs. Primworthy, I have overheard all. I really do not know how I feel. I am amazed. I am mortified too, how I have been taken in with that woman. To me, she is perfectly respectful, appearing to know her place most thoroughly, and yet amongst the servants she must be a regular virago. Still, I feel relieved greatly, disappointed though I am. I am sure I have to thank you for the way in which you elicited the truth from Jones, and really you deserve great credit for being so clever. Mrs. Primworthy smiled with a look of modest satisfaction, and replied, "Why, ma'am, when you told me what the cook had said to you, I suspected at once what was the matter. Well, I think it was very clever of you, but I am greatly to blame, for, do you know, I entirely forgot to make any inquiry respecting the woman's temper, so I am justly punished for my own stupid forgetfulness." "Well, ma'am, I don't know. You might not perhaps have heard the truth, even if you had made that inquiry. You see, some mistresses makes it a sort of rule never to say a single word to harm a servant that applies to them for a character. And I know one lady, for example, who, though she has had really all sorts in service, gives the same character to every one. They are all good-tempered, all cleanly, all sober, and so on, when I know as a fact some of them have been quite different. And then, you see, ma'am, this woman is a knowing one. She never shows her temper to you. Most likely her former mistresses have found her, like you have, quite civil and respectful, though in other kitchens she has gone on as she has in yours. It is seldom, too, we can get servants to speak out of one another. I assure you, ma'am, they'll leave a good place sooner. I don't know when I've heard one speak out like that footman of yours did, and it is a great pity they don't, for how are you or I to know, how's anyone to know, the real characters, when there's an agreement, like, to keep the truth back from us? I suppose, ma'am, you intend giving the cook notice?" "Indeed I shall," replied the lady. "I shall hurry home and give her warning at once, and I do hope, by doing so, I shall get my other servants to stop on. Do you think they will, Mrs. Primworthy?" "Really, ma'am, I hope they may, but I cannot undertake to say. Servants have got such queer, obstinate notions sometimes. But I think if you can send the cook away without letting her fancy anyone has been telling of her, it is the best thing you can do, ma'am." "Good morning, then, Mrs. Primworthy. I must hurry home. I shall call again tomorrow, for in any case you will have to help me. I only trust that it may be one servant and not 5 that I shall require you to find for me." The lady now re-entered her carriage, and the footman closed the door after her. Before, however, driving away, she seemed to have remembered something more, for Jones was sent back with a message relative to the hour of the morrow's visit, having delivered which the man seized the opportunity of adding just a word, as if in self-vindication. "You see, mum, we never likes telling on one another, but when a woman like that cook do forget herself and come to treat her fellow servants as if they were all her inferiors, why, then, I don't think the likes of her don't deserve no consideration, but only to be treated according." "Quite right, Jones. You need never mind telling the real truth in such a case as that." There was now a short pause, Mrs. Primworthy taking advantage of the vacant interval to put on her spectacles and cast her eye through a handful of papers which she drew from her desk. Thinks I to myself, as I mused over the interview just concluded, such, I dare say, is but a revelation of what takes place frequently in a kitchen without ever reaching the ear of master or mistress. Probably many a mysterious warning which has sorely perplexed the head of an establishment is traceable to some such cause as that just divulged. While other reasons are alleged, the truth is that there is some cross-grained cantankerous spirit below stairs who embitters kitchen life to one, if not more, of its occupants, till further endurance of it becomes unbearable. I was about to resume my newspaper when a second lady stepped in by appointment, like myself, to meet a young woman who, fortunately for her, was already awaiting her arrival in another salle d'attente, and had only to be summoned. One glance at the lady convinced me that, although she might be mistress of an establishment, she was not blessed with a family. That somewhat antiquated bonnet, that rather short adhesive skirt, which evidently gave shelter to no crinoline, and that quaintly pinned shawl, all conspired to bespeak unmistakably the old maid. She spoke deliberately, yet somewhat determinedly. Her features seemed to take no interest in the remarks that escaped her, appearing incapable of evincing pleasure, pain, or animation. "You see," she began, with a slowness bordering on solemnity that would almost justify the following specimen of punctuation, "Mrs. Primworthy, I require a person of more than ordinary respectability, situated as I am, and there being only females in my house, it is necessary to avoid the slightest cause for scandal or even remark. You know I keep but the two. I require them to be as correct as myself in every way." "Of course, ma'am, naturally you do," replied the ever-coinciding Mrs. Primworthy, probably thinking all the while she did not see why respectable attendants were more indispensable in the case of this unprotected female than with anybody else, and adding, "Perhaps you'll allow me to call the young woman, as she is waiting, and then you can speak to her yourself." The summons resulted in the entrée of a good-looking girl of about 22, well, but certainly not gaily dressed, whose bright eyes and animated look presented a marked contrast with the unimpassioned aspect of her possible future mistress. Scarcely possible, too, thought I. Surely this cautious maiden lady seeks something far more demure than this damsel. The girl having dropped a propitiatory curtsy, the lady commenced as follows, each word weighted with consistent deliberation. "You have been in service before, I understand?" "Yes, ma'am. I was housemaid and parlourmaid at my last place." "What sort of place was it? A quiet place?" "Oh, yes, ma'am. It was a very quiet place, and very little company." "Did they keep any men servants there?" A decided stress upon that awful word of 3 letters being perceptible. "No, ma'am. They didn't keep no manservants. They had used to keep a footman afore I come, but as I could wait at table, master said as he shouldn't want a man no more." "And did you and the cook do all of the work of the house?" "Not quite all, we didn't, ma'am. There was, beside us two, a boy as used to clean the boots and knives, and run of an errand, and sometimes help wait at table." "Oh, indeed. There was a boy, was there? And pray, what age was the boy?" "Well, ma'am, I think he said he was just turned 16. "As much as that? Was he a big boy or a little boy? Because, you know, some boys at 16 are almost men, and quite as objectionable." At this the girl could not suppress a smile, nor could I. Not in the least disconcerted, however, she replied, "Why, he wasn't very big, nor yet very little, but I never knowed as there was ever anything against the boy." Despairing, I conclude, of eliciting further information touching this interesting youth of 16, the lady, who I noticed had been scrutinizing the young woman's attire from head to foot, next went into the matter of dress, on which subject she appeared to hold decided views. "In case of your entering my service, I must tell you I should require you to dress very simply." "Oh, yes, ma'am, certainly. I've always been accustomed to dress plain." "Yes, but," resumed the lady, "I cannot say I consider your dress today at all suited to a servant." As I glanced at the girl's clothing, I confess I could discover nothing with which even a fastidious mistress could find fault. The bonnet certainly was trimmed with broad green ribbon, and the gown, a clean print, appeared to owe its expansion to one of those contrivances held evidently in virtuous horror by her punctilious criticizer. "You may depend upon it," she continued, "it is very much more becoming that the dress of a female should sit close to her person than that it should be spread out away from it in that manner. I wondered at the moment in what sense the word becoming was to be taken, whether the estimable lady was under the impression that a skirt which sat as hers did tended most to show the figure to advantage. Some further allusion, however, which she made relative to the proverbial unsuitableness of crinoline for going upstairs, soon convinced me that her objection to the article arose solely from her notions of propriety. After some further observations on the part of the lady, in which she pointed out the impossibility of the girl's doing her work properly while encumbered with the appendage in question, the latter yielded so far as to consent to lay it aside and appear sleek and slim during working hours. This point gained, the lady next inquired, "Have you been in the habit of wearing a cap?" "Yes, ma'am. I've always been used to wear a cap." "I wonder whether it is what I should call a cap. Some servants of mine have told me, before I engaged them, that they wore caps, but on coming to me they have had nothing on their heads but a tiny bit of net, which you could not even see unless you stood behind them. Before engaging you, I think I should like to see one of your caps." "Very well, ma'am." "You tell me you have been accustomed to open the door. I hope your manner to visitors is respectful and modest, especially when a gentleman calls." "I have not many gentlemen visitors, but, you know, to a gentleman you cannot be too guarded and reserved in your manner. Never say a word more than you can help, and never be seen to smile or look pleased, as some servants do." The next inquiry on the part of the lady had reference to her leaving her last place, the reason why, to which the girl, with, as I thought, great candour, gave an answer well nigh fatal to her present prospect of engagement. "Well, ma'am, Mrs. always said as she was quite satisfied with the way I did my work, and I shouldn't have had to leave, only she thought as I had an acquaintance." "A what?" "An acquaintance, ma'am." "An acquaintance!" exclaimed the maiden lady, her hitherto inflexible features being for the first time summoned to participate in the horrified amazement with which the disclosure was received. "An acquaintance! Oh, I do not wonder that you should have had notice. I never would keep a servant in my house who was capable of such an impropriety. A place soon loses its name for respectability if acquaintances are tolerated." "But, if you please, ma'am," replied the young woman, "it wasn't true, only Mrs. suspected so." "Ah, but I should be afraid she had some ground for her suspicion. Servants are so foolish, they require so much watching to keep them proper and respectable, that it causes ladies a great deal of trouble and anxiety. It shall never be said that I fail to look after mine. Even on the Sunday, when they must, of course, go to church, I keep them within my own observation. I always make them walk close behind me, and sit near my pew where I can see them, so that no one can even speak to them without my being aware of it. Besides that, I consider it my duty to see all the letters that my servants receive, so as to prevent anything like an improper correspondence." On the disclosure of so complete a system of espionage, the idea seemed to occur to the young woman that the situation might not be quite so desirable as she had supposed, and for the first time there were symptoms of non-acquiescence in the lady's mode of dealing with her domestics. So she replied, still quite respectfully, "Please, ma'am, I've always been used to have an hour or two to myself of a Sunday afternoon, and I ain't never been accustomed to show anybody the letters as I gets." "Well, I could not alter my rules for any servant. I only act in accordance with what I consider to be my duty. If you think my ways too strict, you had better not think of my place." There was a few moments' pause, during which the girl looked down as if to collect from off the floor her thoughts or words wherein to express them, the result being, as I quite anticipated, her final answer. "I'm most afeard, ma'am, I shouldn't give you satisfaction." An exchange of good mornings now terminated this interesting though abortive interview, and Mrs. Primworthy and the lady being left in sole occupation of the office, the latter recommenced. I scarcely thought that person would answer for me when she came into your office. She is evidently fond of dress, and altogether there was a style about her that I do not like in a servant." "Well, ma'am," replied Mrs. Primworthy, "as regards the matter of dress, why, you see, ma'am, servants is apt to get a bit dressy nowadays, and to tell the truth, ma'am, I shouldn't really have considered that girl at all gaily dressed as the times go. Things is a good deal changed now in comparison as they used to be, and the fact is, you can't get servants to dress themselves the same as they did 20 or 30 years ago, with large caps tied under the chin, and bonnets with scarcely any ribbon, and short skimpy skirts and such like. The times is altered, and we shan't have servants the same as they used to be. Never again, no more. Besides, ma'am, mistresses is so different. I know some that takes a sort of pride in the appearance of their servants, and wouldn't have them dressed in the old-fashioned style on no account whatever. How strange that does seem. Perhaps you had better try and find me a more elderly person. Have you anyone on your list at present who you think would suit me?" "No, ma'am, not at present, I'm sorry to say. No one at all, and I'm really afraid I shall have some difficulty in meeting with the kind of person you require." "So I should fancy," soliloquized I, as on the departure of this model mistress, I indulged in speculations as to whence the good lady had derived her notions of domestic treatment, whether she had herself in earlier years been subjected to anything correspondent in the way of supervision and restraint, and if so, how it had answered in her own case. Whether, for example, pains had been taken to impress upon her youthful mind the impropriety of possessing an acquaintance, and all such objectionable superfluities had been judiciously kept aloof. Who knows but what her present freedom from marital encumbrance may be due to the successful adoption of this system? She may perhaps owe her state of blissful celibacy to the praiseworthy intervention of parents, or others who checked every tendency to cultivate an acquaintance, and, thanks to their efforts, life remains to her one continual game of solitaire. But be it even so, I began to have my doubts whether the plan on which this respected lady acted was the right one. I could not bring myself to see the propriety of treating servants like young schoolgirls, to say nothing of the practicable impossibility of doing so. It is, no doubt, a great nuisance to know that one or more young men are hovering over an equal number of your female attendants, and a still greater one when, on the ripening of the acquaintance into something more, a good servant like Betsy takes herself off, for better, for worse, leaving you as good as cookless or nurseless or housemaidless. And it is not to be wondered at if, after such painful experience, the mistress of a house should insert a clause in her resolutions prohibiting henceforth all followers. But this does not answer, nor ever will, while the law of nature continues against it, and so singular am I that I now prefer engaging a servant who has a respectable, well-defined Joseph on the horizon, with whom she is permitted to keep company at intervals, rather than a young woman who, I know, will be on the watch to take in tow the first Dick, Tom, or Harry, perhaps all three, whom she may succeed in signalizing. But the time was passing, and my young woman had not come. Weary of waiting, I rose to depart, when Mrs. Primworthy, knowing I had come some distance, prevailed upon me to wait a little longer. I was about to speak to her about the person whom the maiden lady had sent adrift, and who I thought might have suited me, when she was again summoned back to her office. A young man with light hair and fair complexion, about 25, well got up in a suit of light-coloured garments, and an Albert chain dangling gracefully from a buttonhole, had come to transact business with the accommodating Mrs. Primworthy. He had come in quest of a valet de chambre, was my conclusion, or maybe he is a married man, and is deputed by his wife to negotiate for some female servant or other. It was then with unfeigned surprise that I heard Mrs. Primworthy address him familiarly as Thomas, inquiring interestedly, at the same time, after his parents and family. Greater still was my amazement when, on proceeding to business, I heard the question asked him, "What made you leave your last situation?" Yes, indeed, however hard to credit it, this was a footman out of place. He had come to see if Mrs. Primworthy could find him another berth. "Why did I leave my last situation?" he answered, echoing Mrs. Primworthy's question. "I left it because my feelings would not allow me to remain any longer, and when you hear all particulars, you'll only wonder how I put up with it so long." "Indeed, Thomas, I'm sorry to hear that. Let me see, you was only there 4 months, was not that all?" "6 months, Mrs. Primworthy. Such a 6 months as I hope never to pass in any other situation, and I'll take care I don't, if I can help it. Why, they don't know how to treat a respectable man, and then the things I was expected to do there, it brings up all my indignation to think of them. First of all, I wasn't even given a room to myself, but was forced to share a bedroom with the groom, a common fellow, who used to snore so loud I had to lie awake for hours listening to him. To think of this after what I had been accustomed to, and then this low chap, he knew so little of his place and all that was due to me, that he refused to clean my boots the very first morning after I came, saying I was just as much a servant as he was, so that I had actually to do my own boot cleaning during the whole of those blessed 6 months. Well, but, Thomas, I don't think such little annoyances as those sufficient cause for leaving a good situation." "You wouldn't call it a good situation if you knew all the rest I had to put up with. A good situation indeed. That is just what I was told it was before I went there. I expected they were good, stylish sort of people, who knew what a man in my position would, and what he would not, stand. Such unfashionable hours, too, as they kept, I never heard of before. If they didn't breakfast at 8 o'clock, and then expect me to be all dressed and ready to attend table at such a time of day as that. Of course, I told them at once I couldn't do it. They must get the parlour-maid to wait at breakfast, and answer the bells too, and not expect me anywhere upstairs till after 12 o'clock. That was making rather bold, I think, Thomas. You'll find very few places indeed where you'll be left to yourself till 12 in the day." "Well, Mrs. Primworthy, that is my resolution, and I intend keeping to it. They required nothing more at my former situation, because they knew better what a man like me was entitled to. But there was lots of other things they wanted me to submit to. When I engaged for the place, it was understood that I should have a suit of clothes at the end of every 6 months, making 2 suits in the year. But after I had been there about 2 months, the gentleman sends for me and says he, 'Thomas, there are 2 suits of clothes of mine on the drawers in my dressing room, which you can have. They are not at all worn out. Take and get them altered to fit you, as they are well worth it.' I felt my pride hurt at this, and no wonder. So says I to him, 'No, sir, I'm much obliged to you. I don't wear other people's cast-off clothing, but I don't mind carrying them downstairs and giving them to Bill the groom. I dare say they will be useful to him, and perhaps he won't mind wearing them as they are, without even altering.' And what do you think Mr. says to me because I mentioned this about Bill and the old clothes? Why, he calls me an insolent fellow, and tells me to be off downstairs. So when my time was up at the end of the 6 months, I received my wages right enough, and quite naturally I looked for the suit of clothes according to agreement, thinking how nice it would be for me to have some good new things to come away with, when Mr. turns and begins abusing me like anything, saying he had done more than ever he was bound to do in offering me those old things of his, so I shouldn't get anything more out of him, and it was no use for me trying to, if that wasn't behaving shabby." "I think, Thomas," interposed Mrs. Primworthy, "you was wrong in refusing the clothes. Perhaps if it was not specified that the clothes should be new ones, Mr. considered he was acting up to the terms he engaged you on in offering what he did. I know Mr. has always been represented to me as a thorough gentleman, and the last young man as was there said it was a nice comfortable place, and he was sorry to leave. To tell you the truth, Thomas, I'm afraid you was a little bit spoiled, as the saying is, at the place where you was before." "Well, you do astonish me to think how any man of proper feelings could call that a comfortable place. But it showed the sort of men they had before me when they had actually been in the habit of carrying the coals upstairs. they tried this on with me, when first I came, expecting I was going to carry 2 or 3 great scuttlefuls of coal a day, all the way from the coal cellar up to the drawing room. But as I told them, my hands are not made for that sort of work, and what's more, I understood my place much too well to submit to it if they had been. I never made any objection to lift the coals onto the fire when the coal box stood ready beside the chimney piece, so as to save the ladies the trouble, and as I was anxious to be accommodating, I told them if they would get a sort of coal cupboard built on the landing outside the drawing room door, as Lady did to hold 2 or 3 days' coal, I shouldn't even make a difficulty about filling the coal box from there. But as to carrying the coal box upstairs, I shouldn't do it. And did they actually let you off carrying the coals? Inquired the astonished Mrs. Primworthy, becoming, like myself, more and more amazed at Thomas's presumption. If they did, I think you were treated with great indulgence there altogether. Indulgence! Exclaimed the man. Don't speak of indulgence in that house. I might as well have gone for 6 months to jail at once for all the indulgence that was allowed us there. Of course, a man like me, when he has done his work, likes to spend his evenings now and then with his friends, or at his club. But never could I get out of a night without first asking leave, and then it was always, what do you want to go out for, Thomas? Or where do you want to go to, Thomas? Or how long shall you be gone, Thomas? Making me feel more like as if I was a ticket of leave man than a man bearing the respectable character I did. And would you believe, though I offered to put a lock on the back door and stand the expense myself, so as I might come in any hour of the night without disturbing the family, the gentleman, he wouldn't allow it, saying he wondered only how ever I could ask such a thing. That doesn't much look like indulgence, I should say, should you? As to the matter of going out at nights, Thomas, replied Mrs. Primworthy, I know of many places where that is not allowed for a habit, and yet the master and mistress, I should say, quite as indulgent as need be. But now, what do you wish me to do for you? Because, you see, here is someone else come to do business with me, and I dare say her time is precious, the same as mine is. Why, what I want is a regular first-class situation, and I think a butler's place the one to suit me best, because people always treat a butler with greater respect and consideration than they do a footman. It seems to me a butler holds a situation sort of halfway in a family between the parlour and the kitchen. He's not exactly master, nor he isn't looked upon quite like as a servant. And then, too, his having charge of the wine and the silver and such like things of itself makes his place of importance. And to tell you the truth, Mrs. Primworthy, it is not everyone that is qualified for it, but after the experience I have had... Thomas was not permitted to finish the proclamation of his competency for the office newly aspired to, Mrs. Primworthy making so manifest a transfer of her attention to the new arrival that he made his bow, signifying at the same time his intention of calling again in a day or two. What was effected at the threatened interview I did not learn, but I remember thinking at the time, had I been Mrs. Primworthy, I should be somewhat cautious about helping this airified gentleman into a first-class family, even in the new form of butler. Curiosity tempted me to ask the woman something about him, when she told me she had known him for years, that he had been taken by the hand out of a hovel by someone or other who had given him a decent education and provided him with 2 or 3 successive situations. Till lately none knew his place better than did Thomas, but he had recently held a situation at a Lady Blank's, who had in fact, as Mrs. Primworthy expressed it, completely spoiled him. This lady, under the by no means rare delusion that she had got a treasure, was persuaded that she could not do enough for Thomas, nor require too little from him, coupled with a superstitious dread of the awfulness of the calamity should Thomas ever leave her. Under the combined influence of these joint impressions, it was no wonder if Thomas's indulgences increased both in number and in magnitude. What he liked, he did, and what he liked not, he left alone, or did by deputy, till it had grown hard to define exactly the nature of the position which he held in this Lady Blank's establishment. And there, no doubt, it was he conceived the happy notion of a neutral office between upstairs rule and downstairs servitude, for which he deemed himself so admirably suited. But in an evil day for him, Lady Blank fell ill and died most unexpectedly. Poor Thomas, of course, participated in the general dispersion of her retinue that ensued, winding up in the service of this Mr. Blank, 6 months' experience of which had quite satisfied him. It was now my turn, the last comer, already alluded to, being the individual whom I was expecting, and whose appearance was verily a relief to me, for although I confess to have been somewhat entertained by much I had been fain to listen to, I in truth desired to hear no more. My own business was of a very ordinary nature, and speedily concluded. Had anything passed worth jotting down, it should have been recorded for the benefit of the reader, but I refrain from inflicting the recital of my commonplace transaction upon others who, like myself, have probably had enough of the subject. My admission behind the scenes, if I may so term it, went, I think, to strengthen the notions I had already held as to the correct mode of dealing with domestic servants. I had always been under the impression that there were 2 errors to guard against if you desire to be satisfactorily served. One is the mistake of being over-strict, and the other that of being too indulgent. To steer evenly a midway course between these 2 very common tendencies, while it forms one of the secrets of successful management, is an art of which few are master. And a third notion of mine is this, that for the kitchen, the happiest and most successful form of government is the republican. If cook be president, let her be nothing more. A monarchy below stairs never answers. If cook is permitted to wield the reins, she will very soon assume the whip, and the community will be subject to periodical disruption. Being already prepossessed with the correctness of my theory, I came away with existing impressions deepened by what I was constrained to hear during my half-hour's detention in the servants' registry. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Wonderful London, Its Lights and Shadows of Humour and Sadness. Author unknown. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Yearsley. A shady industry. The individual who is curious as regards the practical working of all, even to the inferior parts, of that legal machinery by means of which order is maintained and the machinations of the roguish and unprincipled held in check throughout the length and breadth of Her Majesty's dominions, may pass an instructive morning at any one of the metropolitan county courts. The business transacted therein makes no figure in the newspapers, but the amount of it that is got through every day is a pattern and an example to courts of higher pretensions. The quality of the justice administered is none the worse because it is somewhat of the off-hand kind. You may have heard it at a reduced price and in the rough, as it were, if you are content to deal with the judge's deputy, the registrar, who sits in a chamber at the threshold of the court, the saving being the not inconsiderable one of half the hearing fees. The registrar's customers are far more numerous than the judge's, and the reason he is able to get through such a prodigious amount of work is that he will have no dealings with disputants. If you wish to argue the matter, you must step into the sanctum where the judge sits and pay for the privilege. It is no uncommon feat for the registrar to knock off a dozen cases within the hour, and with his room crammed to overflowing at 10 in the morning, he will have it cleared and everything made comfortable, with half an hour to spare to restore his coolness and tranquillity before the rising of the court at 4 o'clock. He is a man cool, keen, and quick to arrive at conclusions, and he would need to be, for so surely as his room is cleared today, tomorrow morning it is filled again, and so on all the year round. But however slack other business may be at this cheap and expeditious temple of justice, there are two individuals of the plaintiff kind who are nearly always to be found there. These are the petty money lender, who advertises to advance sums from £2 to £10 at a merely nominal rate of interest, and nothing at all to pay for inquiries, and so on, and the credit draper or tallyman. The worthy pair occupy so much of the time of the court that it would really be no more than fair if, beyond the ordinary fees, they contributed a handsome sum towards the salaries of the judge and his assistant. Defaulting debtors are so numerous with the fraternity in question that they arrange amongst themselves as to the days of the week on which the summonses issued at their instance are returnable, so that each may have a fair field for himself in his turn, and it is generally understood when Grinder against Gudgeon is called by the court crier, announcing that Mr. Tallyman has commenced his innings, that all other business will be at a standstill for an hour or two. The sums sued for are mostly paltry in amount, seldom exceeding £1 or 30 shillings, exclusive of course of costs. But the credit draper and the small loan monger have long ago discovered the truth of the proverb that little fish are sweet, and that when they may be netted in a shoal, they afford sustenance as satisfactory as prey of a larger sort. It is by no means easy to suggest in what way the Small Debts Act might be further amended so as to diminish the vast number of unwary victims who are beguiled into the toils of the spoilers, but it needs no more than a single visit to any county court situated in a densely populated and poor neighbourhood to feel convinced that some alteration is urgently required. The small moneylender is bad enough, with his 25 or 20% preliminary deductions for office, dues, interest, and so on, from the pitiful sum advanced, and his outrageous scale of fines of 3 halfpence per week in the shilling on all amounts in arrears of repayment. But the loan office man has at least this moral advantage over his brother the tallyman, that he is an above-board robber, and by means of printed rules gives notice of the small amount of consideration borrowers may expect if they are so unfortunate as to be placed at his mercy. The tallyman, however, has an altogether different method of conducting his business. It is not going in the least beyond his deservings to say that the credit draper, familiar to neighbourhoods occupied by the labouring classes, is a pest, and that his extermination would be a cause for rejoicing amongst the working men of England, the mainspring of his business success. And there are tally walks, like milk walks, the market value of which is several £1,000s, is the tempting of ignorant and weak-minded women to cheat and deceive their husbands. He is a shrewd villain, and has a knack of turning to profitable account the very means the law has provided for the protection of those on whom he preys. A tally debt, contracted by the wife without the sanction and authority of the husband, cannot be recovered at the county court. But if the credit draper has the husband's signature to the crafty printed form he himself supplies, his claim cannot be disputed. This would seem to be protection sufficient for the male head of the family, but the Eve of old is Eve still, and one of the 1,000 shapes the serpent of modern times assumes is that of a smirking, oily-tongued young fellow with a pack on his back and a yard measure for a walking stick. Love of finery is perhaps the female weakness the tempter most relies on, but this is powerfully seconded by another more deplorable still, fondness for spirituous liquors. In scores and hundreds of cases, as any county court registrar is able to testify by the evidence brought before him, the goods accepted on credit are carried straight to the pawnbroker and deposited with that tradesman, who is able to lend, usually from £0.50 to 3 shillings, on what, according to tally tariff, has cost £1. But this is no affair of the tallyman. The women are welcome to his wares, provided they obtain the husband's signature to his printed form. Some signature at all events. He is not particular. He does not boldly say, "Get some obliging friend to forge your husband's name," but what he does say is, "What I require is a signature. Show me that, and I shall be satisfied." It is easy enough to imagine the picture. The tally tempter with his showy goods spread out and displayed in the parlour. The husbands, of course, are away at their work, and the good lady of the house, with perhaps a neighbour or two present, examining them, the shawls and the dress lengths, with longing admiration. "There you are," says the brisk credit draper. "Now, all I ask is to have those printed forms signed. I do not know where your husbands are, and I do not want to know. I should not know their handwriting if I saw it. I trust to your honour. I am in no hurry for a few minutes. Take the printed forms and get them signed. I will trust you to any amount." Of course, it is vilely wrong, and not a word can be said in excuse of a wife who could behave so basely for so paltry a purpose. It may be fairly urged, however, that in the majority of cases the wives are unaware of the gravity of the offence they commit. "After all," say they, "what is the harm? It's strictly an affair of my own. I shall be able to squeeze the necessary £0.50 a week for payment out of my housekeeping money, and my husband, though none the wiser, will be none the poorer." So the leaguing sisterhood argue, and Mrs. Robinson signs for Mr. Green, and Mrs. Green for Mr. Smith, and the villainy is consummated. It may be said that the credit draper has not much to congratulate himself upon, since, after all, he has not the husband's signature, and that by a very simple process the latter may prove and expose the deception. But men, whatever their station, shrink from making a shameful public show of their wives, and forgery is a terrible word and a potent weapon in the hand of the credit draper, who has become quite an adept by familiar use of it against his dupes. It is the handy lever with which he turns the screw. "Pay up sharp, or I'll have you before a magistrate for swindling me with a signature I've found out is forged." And the husband's work falls slack, and the secret payments cannot be kept up, and more goods are had on credit, to pawn, to get money, to pacify the threatener, until the foolish woman, grown desperate, confesses all to her husband, and some arrangement is made. Much oftener, however, the leech, having once firmly established himself, the blood-sucking process goes on, slowly but surely, for years, a constant cause of impoverishment, and a secret source of uneasiness and discontent for the good man of the house, who is sorely amazed that his hard earnings should not make a better show. It need not be said that the tallyman does not invariably proceed to the iniquitous end of the tether, as above indicated. Commonly he is satisfied to wheedle silly folk into taking his goods on credit for weekly payments at a profit of 300% or so. When they do not or cannot pay, he hauls them to the county court by the score, and makes a morning's work of it. It must, however, be said in praise of the presiding functionary appealed to, that he gives but scant encouragement to Mr. MacGrinder, and knowing the kind of man he is, it is really refreshing to observe him grinning to conceal his wrath at the registrar's compassionate judgments on the poor debtors. "What do you think defendant is able to pay?" he asks MacGrinder. £1 a month," is the prompt response. "Oh, come, less than that will do. Say a shilling a week. Call the next case." Very well, but as he values his precious household goods, let the leniently used defendant take care now as regards punctual payment, or ware hawk, MacGrinder will be down on them. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Wonderful London, Its Lights and Shadows of Humour and Sadness. Author unknown. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Yearsley. The Vampire Bride. Unmissed and unmourned, an institution once highly popular in circles not the most polite, has died out from amongst us, probably never again to be resuscitated, in London at least. It belonged to the theatrical order of things, and was known as the Gaff. Whether Gaff is an affectionate abbreviation of some more pretentious title, or whether the word is a corruption of gag, is unknown. The latter is not improbable. To gag is to prevent speech, and the theatrical representations provided at the humble playhouse in question were characterized by the peculiarity of being enacted in dumb show. Gaffs were permitted to exist only on condition that this regulation was rigorously observed, the least infraction being sufficient to justify the interference of the authorities. To the best of my knowledge, the last of the gaffs was to be found in the neighbourhood of Limehouse. It would be useless to seek it now, for the East London Railway, which has done such good service in sweeping off the face of the earth many hideous slums and shady places in that amphibious region of waterside loafers, crimps, and sailor-catchers, has confounded the very whereabouts of Pidge's ruins on which the establishment stood. The building was never intended to be used as a theatre. It must, I think, formerly have done duty as a dry saltery, or a warehouse for oils and pickles, or for ship's chandlery. Vaporous odours of tar in bulk and applied to rope, of linseed oil, stale, barrelled, junk, bacon and vinegar, were perpetually struggling for mastery within its walls, and through the wide and draughty chinks between the splintered and furrowed floorboards there came up from the cellars below, especially when the audience were very excited, and more than usually demonstrative in their applause, pungent whiffs which were powerfully suggestive of a ship's hold after a protracted voyage. But these peculiarities did not seem to be regarded as objectionable, either by the proprietor or his patrons. Indeed, when a nautical drama was on, they were probably looked on as advantages rather than otherwise, inasmuch as they gave a sea-going flavour to the piece, and caused a titillation of the organs of smell and taste that was in keeping with the treat the eyes were enjoying during the terrific two-handed broadsword combats between the pirates and the men-of-war's men. It is many months since I passed a pleasant hour at the Theatre Royal, Pidge's Ruins, but it was remarkable when, quite recently, I made the discovery that the modest Temple of the Muses was no more, how vividly the events of that last evening were recalled to memory. On the spot, and even as I gazed on the arches of brick that have been planted in the soil the theatre stood on, there, visible to my mind's eye, was the old picture, plain as possible. It was not a nautical piece on this occasion. There had been, as I recollect, a somewhat heavy run on ocean pieces, the Smuggler King, the Skeleton Crew, and the Phantom Bark or the Sea Dog's Destiny, having been played in succession. For a change, we were to be regaled with a drama of domestic life, not of a tame and wishy-washy sort, however. Oh dear, no. The great inducement to go to the Penny Gaff was that in compensation for lack of speech, the proprietor always contrived that the performance should be of the very strongest and hottest. It was demanded equally by those who paid a penny for a seat in the basement, and those who preferred to view the entertainment at their ease, and regardless of expense, and who paid fourpence each for the privileges of a private box. A fig for milk and water, and mawkish sentiment. What the audience required for its money was to be thrilled, to be made to feel their hair rising involuntarily on their scalps, to be made aware of that indescribable sensation known as the creeps, extending from the nape of the neck to the form on which they were seated. In brief, what they wanted was blood, and they asked for it not in vain. The title of the piece fairly foreshadowed its nature. It was the Vampire Bride, or the Scarlet Spot. Over the box entrance, the pit and gallery entrance was through a door at the rear of the premises, appeared a vividly coloured pictorial representation of the drama taken in its essence. No wonder that public curiosity was so greatly excited, or that, on the day when the startling canvas first appeared, it was as much as one policeman could do to control the admiring crowd that came to gaze upon it. It was a picture of which the principal figure was a young lady of charming proportions and magnificent attire. Her dress was of the extreme of ballroom fashion. She wore a necklace of emeralds, and diamond earrings, and ruby bracelets, and sapphire finger rings. Her features were aristocratic. She had a Roman nose. Her golden tresses mingled with the plaits of her gown skirt. Indeed, she was a young creature, altogether lovely to behold, except for two things, or rather for three things. Her eyes were of a heavenly blue, but there was in them a mysterious glitter which reminded the observer of poisonous snakes. Her cheeks were plump and peach-like, but the bloom on one of them, only one, was much deeper than was natural. Indeed, it was a vivid crimson spot, like a large red wafer stuck there. But the strangest of the young lady's features were her teeth. Her rosy lips, being parted, disclosed the teeth of pearly whiteness, but each one brought to a point sharp as those that beset the mouth of a pike. The young lady was terror-stricken, and no wonder. All round and about the couch on which she reclined was a ghastly company of ghostly forms, of young and handsome men, all of them, but each one with a glaring and threatening visage, directed towards the young lady of the crimson cheek and the pointed teeth, and each one thrusting forth out of the shroud in which he was enveloped a naked arm, in the fleshy part of which was distinctly visible a crimson blur, and in the centre of the crimson blur were teeth marks. Beneath appeared in written characters: The Vampire Bride, Mrs. Horace St. Barb; Voltigern the Avenger, Mr. Horace St. Barb; Valentine the Vampire Victim, Master Fitzgerald St. Barb. Other victims by members of the company. Stage boxes, 4d. Be in time. Foreseeing the crush there would be, I was there in time, and was so fortunate, after a severe struggle and an expenditure in bribery of a shilling to two broad-backed young barrowmen, as to maintain my place at the door and to secure a box seat. The theatre, which probably held 300, was crowded to the very footlights. The verge of the stage was even invaded, and several young fellows sat there, smoking their short pipes with perfect complacency. The house was hushed to a state of breathless expectancy, when, a few minutes afterwards, a shrill whistle heralded the rise of the curtain. Evidently there had been a wedding. The Vampire Bride was there, more modestly attired than she appeared on the outer picture, and without the crimson spot, but still recognizable by her light flowing hair, and the peculiar eagerness with which she regarded her new husband, who looked plump and, from a cannibal point of view, eminently eatable. The bridegroom was buoyant, and wore a large bouquet in his bosom, and when the villagers in the invisible distance shouted, as with one voice, "Hooray!" the bridegroom waved a gallant response with his plumed hat, while the bride's eyes glittered, and she covertly champed her teeth, on which a subdued but distinctly audible smacking of lips proceeded from all parts of the house. The scene then changed, and some time was to be imagined as having elapsed. Not so long a time, however, but that the bridegroom had not yet found opportunity to change for something more homely his blue satin marriage waistcoat, or the bride her low-necked bridal raiment. But, alas, what a change had taken place in the young fellow! The plumpness of his cheeks had departed, leaving them wan and hollow. His hair had gone out of curl, his coat sleeves were baggy, It would have been a comfort to him to have had several inches taken in at the back of his waistcoat. He was weak at the knees. He was discovered sitting at the dinner table with his young wife, with whom the estate of matrimony appeared to agree much better. She was not only plump, but plumper than ever. But now on her left cheek appeared the crimson spot, red as blood and large as a penny. The young wife pressed her husband to eat. She carved pounds and pounds of tempting slices from the wooden sirloin, and he devoured them with great avidity, while she, the detestable traitor, the audience began already to see through her real character, stood behind the poor fellow, lovingly urging him on, and helping him to tempting morsels of fat and bits of brown, all the time that, unseen by her victim, she was glaring on him, and mouthing and clashing her dreadful teeth. At last he could eat no more, and with a frightful yawn, which made his cheeks look still more cavernous, intimated that he was sleepy and would like to lie down, with a horrible chuckle of glee, and clicking her teeth together like a pair of castanets. His affectionate wife wheeled a sofa to the middle of the stage, and in something less than half a minute the young husband was snoring on it. Then the dreadful woman's true character was revealed. Stealthily loosing the sleeper's sleeve, she turned it back to the thick part of his arm, and there was a place. It was singular that he himself had not discovered it, as raw-looking as though it had been recently burned with a kitchen poker. Over this spot the false wife gloated, grinning and glaring, and clapping her hands and grinding her abominable teeth, until it was quite dreadful to look at her, and then she stooped to the arm as though to kiss it, and she seemed to continue to kiss it, while the applause of the audience, the whistling, the hand-clapping, the stamping, was again and again renewed. At last she rose, and, with the crimson spot on her cheek now glowing brilliant almost as a railway danger signal, uttered a diabolical laugh and quitted the apartment. The victim on the couch did not move. He lay there so long, 5 minutes perhaps, that his friends and relatives grew alarmed as to his welfare, and came to inquire for him. At least 2 of them did so. An old woman with a witch cloak and a witch hat and a witch crutch stick, and Voltigern the Avenger. The old woman and the Avenger came in together, and, approaching the couch, uttered shrieks of grief and rage on finding that its occupant was dead and cold. It was then made to appear by signs that Voltigern and the victim were brothers, and the old woman was the mother of both. The latter, turning back the dead man's sleeve, discovers the manner of his death, and in dumb motions makes known to Voltigern that this is the 7th young husband the vile vampire has served so. On which mother and son arrive at a mute understanding, and she hands him a vial largely labelled poison, and they make their exit, and the scene again changes. The poison, however, is not for the base destroyer of 7 husbands. The following scene reveals the fact that there has been another wedding, and that this time it is Voltigern the Avenger who has led the Lady of the Scarlet Spot to the altar. There is a repetition of the hurraying villagers, and the lady once more covertly glares and grinds her teeth. But on this occasion the bridegroom glares too, and in confidence exhibits to the audience the poison bottle empty, and an admiring murmur runs through the house as he makes signs that he himself has drained every drop of it. The noble Voltigern, with a subtlety of craft equalling that of his wicked bride, had taken this means of becoming his brother's avenger. He had poisoned his blood, so that when the horrible vampire woman began to practice her teeth on the thick part of his arm, she would precious soon find out the mistake she had made. It was an ingenious idea, and one worthy of the success which attended it. There was a marriage feast, at which the old woman, still wearing the witch hat and cloak, was the only guest, and there appeared to be enough of the wooden sirloin left to furnish a plentiful meal. They all eat of it, and then they all drink, and then the old woman and Voltigern begin to nod. The opportunity is one too good to be lost by the female fiend of the scarlet spot. The old woman is presently led out of the room, and then out comes the fatal sofa, and Voltigern reclines on it, and in a twinkling is serenely slumbering. Again the victim's arm is bared with all the etceteras, but with a grim difference this time. The vampire bride has been detestably engaged not more than 2 minutes, when she rises from her knees and looks fearfully around, at the same time passing one hand rapidly across and across her waistband, and shuddering visibly. Her pains increase, and presently her cries make the roof ring, and she sinks writhing to the ground. At this signal Voltigern the Avenger bounds from the sofa, and the old woman with her crutch-stick this time comes in, and while the latter heaps curses on the prostrate bride, Voltigern, with a hideous mocking laugh, shows her the empty poison bottle, and immediately afterwards falls down and expires. The ghost of his brother then rises amidst the bluest of blue fire, and inexorably beckoning her, she is helpless but to obey, and tottering to the trap on which the ghost stands, there is another tremendous flare-up of blue fire, and they both descend, while the gaff resounds with plaudits gruff and shrill from its gratified audience, that, for the most part, there were 2 performances nightly, paid once more, and kept their good seats to witness the vampire bride all over again. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Wonderful London, Its Lights and Shadows of Humour and Sadness. Author unknown. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Yearsley. Jack's Delight. What is a savage? If he may be correctly defined as a creature whose habits, manners, and customs are completely opposed to those of people who cultivate and abide by the ways of civilization. A human being, the main principle of whose existence is a strict observance of those animal instincts which lead the possessor to shut out all considerations but such as are of a purely selfish character. If it means a 2-legged animal, brutal and cruel, and eager to make prey of the weak, being always well primed with cunning to avoid the strong, one who lurks in shady dens by day, and coming out after dark, painted and befeathered, and fully armed with his or her peculiar weapons of warfare, perambulates the familiar hunting ground, seeking whom he may devour, then I make bold to assert that between Tower Hill and Limehouse Hole, on the banks of the River Thames, and within a stone's cast of the water's edge, may be found a tribe of barbarians, ruthless as any to be met with in cannibal Fiji, or the domains of the sable monarch of that kingdom of rum and blood, Dahomey. As a rule, the savages in question are of the she kind. There are, of course, males of the community, but in this instance the natural order of things appears to be reversed. Ordinarily, as regards predatory creatures, it is the male who tracks and brings down the game, to share it with the she, but amongst the savages of Ratcliffe Highway, it is the female who hunts, while the he creature lurks in ambush, to give assistance if need be, or remains at home at the den, all ready to fall, tooth and nail, on the victim lured thither by his consort, to despoil and damage him. Liverpool, Portsmouth, Plymouth, indeed every seaport town in the 3 kingdoms, are capable of producing specimens of the pests alluded to, but they abound especially at this part of the port of London, and are of a breed fiercer and more merciless than the others. The colony is not at all a modern one. It certainly existed 100 years ago, when Dibdin immortalized Molly of Wapping Old Stairs. Until within the last 2 or 3 years, there flourished at the heart of this delectable place, and it would still be flourishing but for the formation of a railway, a horrible headquarters of the savages in question, known as Tiger Bay, a hideous network of courts and alleys, to which inebriated members of the mercantile marine were nightly inveigled, and robbed and half-murdered, and where, in cellars and dreadful back rooms, swarms of Lascars and Malays herded together to indulge in mad opium orgies. Tiger Bay is now abolished, but the tigresses remain. The hunting grounds thereabouts are too fruitful to be abandoned, when the alternative is the easy one of crowding a little closer, while, as for the opium devourers, it is sufficient to say that Pigeon Johnson, the Celestial whose establishment was better known and patronised than any other in the Bay, may still be seen in the neighbourhood, cheerful looking as ever, and perhaps with even a smarter tie to his pigtail, which looks as though business was still brisk with him. To be enabled to form anything like an adequate idea of the habits and haunts of the tigresses, however, they should be seen by day as well as by gaslight. It may be mentioned that what is commonly known as Ratcliffe Highway is a narrow thoroughfare of about a mile in length, containing a large number of shops, houses of business, chiefly in the shipping interest, and all of a respectable kind. Besides these, however, the highway contains scores of public houses, to most of which either singing or dancing rooms are attached, and dozens of dirty little beer shops, suggestive of the good dry skittle ground in the rear, and also of the confidence trick, with an equal number of cook shops and coffee shops, kept by persons of almost as many different nationalities as there are natives of other climes who, in the capacity of sailors, find temporary accommodation ashore here. At any time of the day the highway presents a spectacle which no visitor from the country should miss. The whole human family, in the rough perhaps, but as furnishing a fair idea, this is always preferable to the extreme smooth, is here seen perambulating the streets, with every shade of colour, from the dumpling-faced, blue-eyed, flaxen-haired Dutchman to the unadulterated African, with his woolly curls tightly twisted as tiny coils of iron wire, and his coal-black face shining with the dressing of butter rubbed into it when he made himself respectable to come ashore. Men with faces of burnished brown, like to a polished copper coal-scuttle, other men of a cloudy reddish brown, like the same article of domestic use when neglected by the maid in the kitchen. Yellow men with tawny eyes, and tawny men with yellow eyes, and with slits in their ears and the cartilage of their nose, to contain ornaments on high days and holidays, and with a knife hanging from a leather thong at their waist, equally useful to carve ship's junk, or to let out the hot blood of an enemy. All manner of men, not forgetting the prematurely sage Yankee, with his lengthy visage and sallow complexion, the Malay with his hideous wooden lip ornament, the grave Turk, and the shambling, spindle-shanked half-caste, with his calico trousers. With this great variety of game to be discovered in every direction, it may seem odd that the tigresses of the district are not always on the alert, but they, like the other carnivora, are not partial to hunting by daylight. Besides, they need relaxation after the fatigues of the chase of the previous night. Their relaxation takes the form of swallowing gin in any obtainable quantities. Here they are, noonday though it is. You have but to push open the swinging door of any one of the 20 or so of public houses, and you will find them thronging the drinking bars. They may make this public display of themselves in undress with impunity, for it is scarcely likely that any victim on the lookout for the particular black-eyed Susan, who last night robbed and so scandalously treated him, would succeed in picking her out from a swarming sisterhood, between the members of which there exists such a strong family likeness. It would be a good thing, however, if weak-headed, soft-hearted Jack ashore, whose workaday world is the wide ocean, and his paradise Wapping, could see unadorned the beauties to whom, when half seas over, he delivers himself with such childlike confidence. It would be a mere waste of finery to wear it just now, and so the common apparel of the lass that loves a sailor is rags, filthy bodices, draggle-tail skirts, slipshod feet, hair all tousled and loose, and adorned, instead of flashy pins and ribbons, with particles of the straw or the flock bed from which she has lately risen. Blear-eyed, puff-cheeked, brutal-looking creatures without exception, with the artificial black of their eyebrows and the ruddling of their faces still remaining from last night, but smeared and smudged the one into the other, and blended with dirt, and combining to lend them a pantomime impish look that matches very well with their hoarse voices, and with the unquenchable voracity with which they swallow down the fiery liquid which they consume out of pewter measures. It is impossible to conceive anything so hideous and disgusting as these wretched, gin-swigging women, both as regards their appearance and the language, the appalling oaths and blasphemies that issue from their mouths. Talk of savages! A North American Indian who discovered his squaw in such a revolting condition would undoubtedly knock her on the head offhand, and receive afterwards the thanks of his tribe for the meritorious action. But this is only one side of the canvas. Supposing it to be noon when it is viewed, let 10 hours elapse, and once again take a peep at it. It is 10 o'clock at night now, and though Ratcliffe Highway itself is but dingily lighted, the public houses, the concert halls, the dancing and singing saloons are all gay and sparkling with gas and chandelier drops and plate glass, and on every side is to be heard the twanging of harps, the scraping of fiddles, the strumming of pianos, and the brayful music of brass bands, setting the tunes to which the dancers caper. And where are the dreadful petticoated creatures that this morning made these same places hideous? They are there still, but how altered! They have molted their foul rags, and taken to themselves instead silk and satin of emerald green and rosy pink and delicate amber. They have invested sixpence at the hairdresser's, and with a cheerful coat of paint have renovated their dilapidated complexions. They have pencilled their eyebrows and whitened their necks and arms, and bedizened themselves with bangles and bracelets and earrings and necklaces. But they are tiger women, none the less for all this artifice and concealment. Their savage and cruel nature peeps out of their cold, quick eyes all the time they are pretending blandishment with spoony Jack ashore, who, despite 10,000 warnings as to the inevitable consequences, will seek his brief spell of recreation and money spending in the neighbourhood where his messmates from time out of mind have spent theirs. Here he finds his faithful Nan, his constant Jenny, his lovely Poll, of whom he has sung with manly emotion many and many a time when 1,000 miles at sea, and, stupid fellow that he is ready to do the handsome thing by her, to stand any quantity of spirituous liquor, to take her out to the highway, and buy her a keepsake or a love token, that she may bear him in mind when, again, he is far away. He should be able to read her wicked mind all the time he is relieving his overcharged bosom in this maudlin manner. Love tokens, indeed. The love token she wants, and will have if her luck holds good, is that bag of his with the money in it, though it be every penny he possesses. That ring on his finger, that pin in his scarf, that watch in his pocket, that jacket on his back. She has marked them, one and all, as her own, and unless the sweet little cherub, who is so constantly on the lookout for the welfare of poor Jack, forbids it, she will make swag of the lot before he is many hours older. So drink up, Jack, my dear, and let us have another pint of gin to our better acquaintance. It is not as though this great rendezvous for seafaring men was haunted by but a few of these inexorable harpies. It would probably not be beyond the mark to say that any Saturday or Monday night, within 2 hours of the lighting of the gas, there would be found more than 1,000 of them hunting for prey between the Gunboat Tavern at the Limehouse end and the Prussian Flag in Ship Alley at the London end. And when one considers that this kind of thing is going on to a greater or less extent every night of the year, and that the whole heartless, conscienceless tribe depend wholly and solely on sailor plunder for their maintenance, and that of the vile male land sharks, who doubtlessly take the lion's share of the spoil, some idea may be formed of the enormity of the evil. It may be said that sailors are, or should be, able to take care of themselves, and that if they play the part of fools they must put up with the consequences. But so long as the law professes to protect fools from the machinations of rogues, sailors should not be permitted, any more than other folk, to suffer to a greater extent than is avoidable, and that it would be possible to mitigate, if not to eradicate, the glaring vice and depravity that so insolently holds its own in the localities indicated, no sane man can doubt. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Wonderful London, Its Lights and Shadows of Humour and Sadness. Author unknown. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Yearsley. A police court morning performance. The spectacle of the prodigious rogues who lately figured 3 times a week before Sir James Ingham at Bow Street Police Court may be likened, as compared with the miserably small fry that usually make their appearance before his worship, to a brace of voracious sharks floundering in a herring net. It is, fortunately, not often that such leviathans of ocean intrude in the shallow and turbid waters over which a stipendiary magistrate has jurisdiction, to disturb the retailing of justice to young beginners in the criminal business, and to the old hands who, if success were invariably the reward of industry, would have retired to Portland years ago, but who, owing to physical or mental incapacity, drag on to the end of their tether in the humble paths of petty larceny. A morning at Bow Street and a morning at any other of the metropolitan police courts just now exhibits a remarkable difference. In the ordinary course of events, it must be dreadfully dreary work occupying the judicial bench from 10 in the morning till 4 or 5 in the afternoon in an ill-ventilated, evil-smelling apartment, with nothing to vary the depressing monotony of sights and sounds but an occasional exceptionally fresh-coloured young policeman, or a smart female witness, with now and again a sharp passage of arms between the solicitors at their table. Apart from these godsends, a magistrate must find it terribly slow work. It is always the same picture, always the railed-off space as a background, crowded with an unwashed public, consisting for the most part of the outer-work part of the population, or those who are too lazy to seek employment, and who find this a cheap and agreeable way of killing time. They are not all of this kind, however. As sure as the doors are opened, there will flock to the front of this public space as many as it will hold of villainous-looking men and lads with heads close cropped, or of the crow's nest pattern, who by some mysterious influence are drawn hither, evincing a greedy interest in the proceedings. They lean their ragged elbows on the bright barrier bar, and, as a rule, suck the same, as though the everlasting criminal atmosphere of the court had imparted to it a refreshing flavour, grateful to their vitiated palate. Although manifestly of the same family, as regards an instinctive relish for this kind of amusement, they hold no communication with each other during the proceedings, except an occasional push with the knee or a dig with the elbow, to call attention to points specially worth noting. But as each case is drawing to a conclusion, and there arrives the anxious moment when his worship, having heard the evidence in silence, purses his lips and knits his brow, pondering the sentence, the eyes in the villainous front row of heads light up, and by means of dumb motions of their lips they telegraph to each other their idea of how many months of imprisonment will be the prisoner's doom. 4, 3, 6. Their experience is so extensive that really there should not be this wide difference of opinion. But then, the law is so delightfully uncertain, and it is almost as good fun as betting on racehorses to indulge in this friendly rivalry of guesswork. 3 months it is, and the lanky youth who had so guessed it looks for the moment as pleased as though he had won money. The dry details, as set forth in the newspaper police reports, give but a poor idea of the queer jumble of cases to which it is his worship's duty to patiently listen and give judgment on. Such miserably poor and paltry cases, most of them, that the money involved in 500 would not amount to nearly as much as Messrs. Benson and Co. confess to having swindled a too confiding public out of in a single day. Call the next case, and a door at the back of the court is grudgingly opened, as though the space beyond was stocked with cases that would take flight like birds from an aviary if they were not well looked after, and the court policeman, who is no more like the being that does duty on beat than a sheepdog is like a pet poodle, conducts to a breadth of raised planking, hedged in fore and aft with an iron bar, and called the dock, a haggard and hungry-looking wretch, grey-headed and tattered, and with dried mud on the back of his coat, as though he had been down in the road. He owns to the name of John Sparrow, and his offence is that the evening previously he had endeavoured to steal from the shop of Amos Levi a coat valued at 18 shillings. The case is as perfect as a case can be. There is the coat, muddy as when picked up after the prisoner had thrown it down. There is Amos Levy. There is the detective, who watched the prisoner for nearly half an hour, walking to and fro, before he ventured to make a snatch at the garment. The front row in the public compartment exchange glances which denote their contempt for John Sparrow when this last bit of evidence is given, and even the detective appears to think that it is a damaging feature in the case. Not so, however, his worship on the bench, negligently posed and drumming with his fingers on the knee he is nursing. He raises his head for a moment, and gives John Sparrow a glance that, to the shrewd observer, conveys nothing to the wretched prisoner's disfavour. Possibly in his mind's eye he can see how the man now before him, driven to desperate extremes and fascinated by that slop-made coat, beckoning, "Come and steal me," as it swung in the wind, neglected and unguarded, outside Mr. Levy's shop. "Hang it," mutters gaunt John Sparrow. "Hang it, I'm a good mind, I will too." And he walks towards the temptation, sternly gulping down his honest heart, that seems inclined to leap out of his mouth and go and tell of him. But at the last moment his screwed-up courage falls slack, and he passes on, and he passes and repasses, the detective in the shadow of a doorway on the opposite side confounding him for keeping him waiting so long, for half an hour, and those 30 minutes of prolonged cold and emptiness act as the final straw that breaks down his virtuous forbearance. The deed is done, and here he is to answer for it. "Is anything known of him?" his worship asks. No, not by the police, that is to say, but the aggrieved Mr. Amos, whose slop coat is certainly all the worse for being dropped in the mud, and who is greatly agitated at the prospect of the robber getting off with anything less than 6 months' hard labour, here exclaims, "I know him, your worship. Why, you'd hardly think it, but he actually worked for me till 4 months ago, when his 2 children died of smallpox, and I took the work away from him." "Who have you been working for since that time, prisoner?" the magistrate asks. "I haven't pulled a needle since that time," replies John Sparrow in grim despair. "I've had 'em down, off and on, 5 of 'em, since that time. Why, Lord send I'd have caught it and died myself. It would have been better for me." Mr. Amos nods his head, as though he has reason for thinking so too. 6 weeks' hard labour, pronounced his worship, which was a merciful sentence, inasmuch as he might have said 6 months instead. But the unfortunate tailor is too thoroughly mazed in a black fog of despair to appreciate the magistrate's kind forbearance. 6 weeks, 6 months, 6 years. What does it matter when it has come to this? If all the cases that came before his worship were of a like nature, his would be but a doleful duty indeed. But a great part of his duty, though disagreeable enough, is not very distressing when once he has grown seasoned to it. For instance, nobody but aldermen think of trying the saving effects of a moral drawn on the abuse of alcohol on every drunk and incapable who is brought before them. Short work is made of each morning's batch of inebriates by the metropolitan magistrates. Unless the offence has been aggravated by violence, the cases are put down almost as fast as they are put up. It is dirty work at best, and the sooner it is cleared off the better, and half a dozen lines next morning in the newspaper contain all the public knows or wishes to know about the matter. But it will often happen that a magisterial decision is given in half a dozen lines, or even less, that go but a little way towards conveying the story. Take, for example, the brief few words, "The prisoner, who was brought up on remand, was discharged for want of further evidence." That was all that was said concerning the case that came next but one to that of the wretched journeyman tailor, but to an eyewitness it was a thrilling romance in its way. He was a lithe-built, brutal-looking ruffian of 25 or so, with a chest and a pair of shoulders that contrasted strangely with his ghastly paleness and his whining, cowardly aspect. He was charged with knocking down a gentleman at midnight in the neighbourhood of King's Cross, with intent to rob him. A policeman, arriving suddenly on the spot, found the gentleman on the ground, and the prisoner standing over him, and when the officer attempted to lay hands on him, he took to his heels, but was captured. The gentleman had failed to appear at the first hearing, and prisoner was remanded, and now again brought up. If there had been the least doubt as to the villain's guilt, it would have been set at rest by the desperately eager glance he cast about him, tiptoeing while in the dock to do it, in order to find out if the dreaded witness was present. He appeared to be much more at his ease after the survey, and was so still, when some person among the crowd coughed in a loud and peculiar manner. There, however, still remained the policeman who had caught the young fellow in the act, and his testimony might be sufficient to send the accused to prison for a lengthy term at any rate. But the policeman, as it happened, was a blundering countryman, new in the force, and the peculiarly sharp solicitor the young fellow's friends had contrived to engage baffled him so with his questions that the poor constable was presently made to prevaricate and stammer in a nervous manner. What the sharp solicitor wanted to show was that his innocent client, seeing a gentleman prostrate on the pavement, was in the act of rendering him humane assistance, when the policeman unwarrantably pounced on him. "Is there any further evidence against the prisoner?" the magistrate presently exclaimed, pardonably impatient at the constable's floundering. "No." "Then the prisoner is discharged," to the so great amazement of the latter that he at first stared incredulously at the magistrate, and then laughed outright, while equally unable to retain his emotion, the owner of a voice in the crowd loudly exclaimed, "Beat 'em again!" and then darted gladly out of court, to be followed presently by the lucky young garrotter who had experienced such a narrow escape. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Wonderful London, its lights and shadows of humour and sadness. Author unknown. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Yearsley. Cockney Cave Dwellers. There is no portion of London so notorious throughout the length and breadth of the land as St. Giles's, nor is its prominency due to modern appliances of swift communication. Years, 100 or more, before the electric telegraph was commonly utilized, or the railway train was dreamt of, the evil reputation of St. Giles's was carried by steady-going wagon travellers, who had occasional dealings with the wicked metropolis, to country places and provincial towns. and in those days it would have been difficult indeed to have said worse of the abominable district than it deserved. Its filthy narrow ways, its blind alleys, and its cellars combined to make it a hotbed for any epidemic that might chance to prevail. The most honest of its inhabitants were the scum and refuse of the population, and the poorest and most depraved of the Irish. Its taverns and hole-and-corner lodging-houses and sly drinking shops were mainly supported by highwaymen, footpads, petty thieves, beggars, and professional cadgers. The tree of St. Giles's the Foul was planted 700 years ago in loathsome soil, and through all that time the fruit was always worthy of the parent stem. As early as the commencement of the 12th century, the wife of Henry I, Queen Matilda, taking pity on the many who were afflicted with the terrible disease called leprosy, caused to be erected a hospital for the exclusive use of the poor wretches in question, and it was on account of the said asylum being dedicated to a Grecian saint, St. Giles, that the district got its name. It was at this place that the gallows was set up when, in 1413, it was resolved that its hateful presence should no longer afflict Smithfield, and, as everyone has heard, it was at one of the taverns already mentioned that the cart containing the hangman and the parson, and the miserable culprit and his coffin, stopped on the way to the gallows, so that the doomed man might receive the comfort of a drink of strong liquor to keep his courage up for the sad business before him. The St. Giles's bowl, as it was called, was no chance gift of any compassionate boozer who at that time might be on the tavern premises, but a solemn and recorded benefaction of the hospital authorities. It was to St. Giles's in the Fields that stout Lord Cobham was dragged by the furious mob, after a woman had broken both his legs with a stool, and there hanged and burnt as a traitor and heretic. And again, to come down to comparatively modern times, if the chroniclers are to be believed, it was in St. Giles's that the appalling plague of 1665 first woke to life, and began its fatal ravages. 2 Frenchmen residing at the upper end of Drury Lane are said to have been the first that were attacked, and the deadly malady, before it had finished its work, in St. Giles's parish alone, had provided 3,216 bodies for the pitmen who came round so many times each day, ringing the bell and leading the horses attached to the great black cart. It seems almost as though some of the contamination of the leprosy kind must have sunk into the soil of St. Giles's, vitiating the blood of the later inhabitants, and making them sluggish and loath to rise and shake off their ancient habits of foulness and squalor. But the desirable feat has been at last accomplished, I fancy I hear the reader say, who, out of curiosity, may have made a recent flying visit to St. Giles's. Yes, indeed, there is now scarcely any remnant of the old abominable slums left. Baths and washhouses have been built, with many other handsome buildings for public and private business purposes, and there is, reared on the site of one of the ugliest old streets, a splendid new board school, towering high in the air, a triumphant monument of vice invaded in its own stronghold and signally vanquished. Nevertheless, despite these gratifying evidences, I must be permitted to demur to the statement that St. Giles's the Detestable has been utterly uprooted and routed. It is not so, or was not long ago, and I am afraid that in so short a time the good work has not been accomplished. As, for instance, it can scarcely be said that St. Giles the Ancient is no more, while there exists within his domain any remnant of the people there who dwell in dark and deep cellars under the houses. In the old times this was one of the most notorious features of St. Giles's, and despite all that may be said to the contrary, the objectionable custom is not yet abolished. I think that it is dying out, however, for in my recent exploration I counted no more than 14 in the street which at all times has been most famous for these residences below the level of the gas pipes and the haunts of the sewer rat, Dudley Street. Dudley Street is still faithful to its venerable traditions. It always was given over to vendors of old clothes and boots and shoes, and to a great extent it is now. The living sellers are under the old clothes shops, and in many cases the wooden trapdoor in the common pavement, the one only means of ingress and exit of light and air, is festooned and overhung by old boots and trousers, much, I should imagine, to the inconvenience of the subterranean lodgers. I do not know anywhere else in England where such a strange sight may be seen. They are not what might be called semi-cellars, half above and half below the ground, but deep down excavations, requiring a considerable flight of steps to reach the floors, and they appear to extend under the shop and the house passage as well. They had need be large, for in many instances they are made to serve as workshops as well as living places, the cellar dwellers' chief occupation being to translate. They call themselves translators. Worn-out old boots and shoes into wearable ones. They are distinct from the tribe of cobblers and shoemenders. They fetch their material from their employers' premises in a great sack or truck, and it consists of a pell-mell collection of oddments in the way of foot coverings, reeking of mould and mildew, and out of this they contrive pairs suitable for sale at the adjacent shops and stalls. And to look down into one of these cellars at night time and find father, mother, and the elder male and female branches of the family clustered in all their dirt and raggedness in the midst of the unsavoury heap of half-rotten leather, with wisps of wax end to keep their hair from bobbing into their eyes as they hammer and stitch by the light of the tallow candle or paraffin lamp, is not a spectacle to make a man thrill with pride. In one place I found, besides the translators toiling at the heap of malodorous leather, 4 small children crouching half-naked and unclean by the fire-hearth, and looking exactly as one might expect little boys and girls to look who all through the long winter live in semi-darkness, and breathe air that would ultimately undermine the constitution of a horse or donkey, and who see no more of the living and moving world than the muddy boots and leggings of pedestrians hurrying to and fro within a foot of the street door by the ceiling. It is shocking to find how possible it is for penury and intimate and long-continued acquaintance with degraded habits and usages to blunt and destroy that inborn love and care for their young, which is part of the nature of human creatures, as well as of inferior animals, to say nothing of cultivation and civilization. I inquired of a woman. She was not a translator, but took in washing, as I should imagine from the quality and quantity of the linen which was hung round the great coke fire to dry, whether she did not think it would be better for her children, there were several of them rolling about the floor, if she found lodgings a little higher up in the air. She resented the suggestion with an amount of ferocity that induced me to back precipitately towards the ladder. She was all right where she was, she declared, and demanded to know if I was one of those humbugging meddlers who came prying about, getting decent people turned out of their comfortable homes. I took the liberty of remarking that the place was terribly dark and ill-ventilated, and that the walls were not so dry as they might be, but still she reiterated that she was quite comfortable and meant to stick there. I asked her if this was the sleeping place as well as the living and working place, and she stoutly declared that nobody slept in the cellars. It wasn't allowed. I have been told this before by the Dudley Street cellar dwellers, and it may of course be a fact. At the same time, it is somewhat difficult to understand that these people have such an affection for underground residence that, poor as they are, they will have it, even though they hire a room to sleep in elsewhere. One cannot easily realize the picture of a mother and father and children turning out of the snug cellar and from the fire at 10 o'clock of a winter's night to seek a cold bedchamber in some adjoining street. Nor, I am sorry to say, has social reform in 7 dials made such healthful strides that it is only necessary to close the cellars and padlock the trapdoors to put the last finishing touch to the district's perfection in the matter of habitable tenements. Where so much was vile, the cure must of necessity be somewhat tardy, and it cannot be denied that a great deal remains yet to be done. In the 7 streets which radiate from a common centre, and in the numerous courts and alleys, may be found human dwellings which could hardly have been more objectionable from a sanitary point of view when St. Giles's was in its lusty prime. Horrible places, where foul rag heaps do duty as beds on the mud-coloured boards, and where the walls are black and broken, the ceiling in holes, the windows dilapidated and patched, and plugged with paper and rags. A rare magazine of appropriate combustibles, should the prevailing epidemic chance to throw its baneful torch there. And in the midst there is Lumber Court, an alley of brokers and old furniture dealers, with a plentiful collection of second-hand bedding and mattresses and palliasses. The sanitary inspector, of course, keeps a watchful eye on these fruitful sources of disease, and if he is made aware of the least necessity for doing so, as in duty bound, has the frowsy things properly fumigated. But nevertheless, the articles in question, exposed for sale, look terribly dirty, and as antagonistic to balmy sleep as that iron couch of torture to be seen at the Tower of London, and known as Little Ease. End of chapter 27.